Hi everyone, welcome. So today we've got something slightly different, and I'm really delighted to be joined by two of my very favourite people, STILLTish and Robbie Travers. And it's a little bit of a different format, as you will see, because we're here to basically have a look at a video interview that was done fairly recently by a couple of people who run a channel called Gender Nebulus. Freda and Victoria, and in this video they interview Susie Green, who is née of Mermaids and also of Gender GP, because she's left there. She has a very long and important history in the gender wars. She also has a trans child. And we're going to basically have a look at this video, break some of it down for you, because we found some really important points that we want to present a different commentary on. You'll only have my face. I'm really sorry about that, because basically Tish and Robbie have got some limited internet today, so I apologize for that. And I hope you get something out of it. So here we go.
I'm not allowed to talk about my daughter's age, otherwise she tells me off. But I can be like 24 years ago. Actually, no, go back 2 more. So when she was 4 years old, she was assigned male at birth, first kid. I was in my mid-20s, and when she was 4 years old, she told me that God had made a mistake and she should have been a girl, and kind of shocked me, but didn't at the same time. So at that point, I told her it was okay to be a boy and like girl stuff, but that didn't make her a girl. But she just kept reiterating it and saying, this is who I am. She kept telling me she was a girl. So when she was 6, she asked me when she could have the operation. And it was at that point that I went, right, okay, I need to do something about this. I can't just keep telling her that she's a boy and suck it up almost. That I need to do something, because also that constant reiteration of you're not a girl was actually making her miserable.
So I think one of the big problems here with what Susie Green is saying, and I think why it's so objectionable, is she is telling her child, firstly, he's a boy, suck it up. Now, there seems to be that Susie Green is actually presenting this as a binary, that her child has to suck it up, the fact that he's a boy and he has to deal with that, and that means the stereotypes that come along with that. That's the first concern. A second concern that I think immediately comes from this is, how does a 6-year-old child know about a sex change operation? How on earth does a 6-year-old child know about a sex change operation? It has to be asked. That's a really important question. Why on earth does a 6-year-old child know that and know that that's an option? Because obviously it's been promoted to a child that it's an option for individuals in their position. So I think that that's a real concern, and that would be my real concern with what Susie Green has said.
Yeah, those two comments both jumped out at me, but also to bear in mind that before our children who are gay are aware of their sexuality, not all, but many gay boys, you get kind of a clue because of their interests. Not all boys who are atypical in what they like turn out to be gay, but many of them do. And I noticed that she doesn't mention her husband's intervention, because he was really not happy about having a gay child. And it's noticeable that was in her TED talk, which she's now removed. But I think there are still copies of it available. And clearly that was a factor, that the dad didn't want his child playing with toys that he thought should only be appropriate for the opposite sex.
Jack was my first child. I thought I knew what to expect, but really I started to notice that as soon as he got mobile and could express himself, he was gravitating towards things that you would see as stereotypically female. But I wasn't bothered. That didn't faze me at all. As far as I was concerned, children should be allowed to play with whatever they want to play with, even if it doesn't fit the norm. And at the childminders, when I went back to work, Jack's favourite outfits were the tutu and the Snow White costume. And again, that was fine. But not for Dad. So Jackie's dad struggled and he blamed me. His thoughts were that because I allowed the Polly Pocket and the My Little Pony, that I was facilitating and encouraging. And I disagreed, and it caused tensions. what I had come to the conclusion with over sort of the sort of years up until she was about 2 was that I had a very sensitive, quite effeminate little boy who was probably gay. But Jack's dad did not approve of our child's effeminate behaviour. And it created such tensions that we ended up in couples counselling. We went to couples counselling, and what they said to us as parents, that we had to agree. No matter what it was that we agreed upon, we had to agree. At that point, Tim decided that I must agree with him, apparently. And all the girl toys, or girly toys as such, were taken away and put away, and Jack was made aware that this was not appropriate. And a suddenly confident, happy little boy became quite quiet, withdrawn, very clingy and tearful. I didn't like it, and I didn't think it was right. And really, for me, the point at which I really put my foot down was about a few weeks later, I think, and my mum phoned me and said, "What's going on with Jack?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, I phoned a couple of days ago to ask what Jack wanted for Christmas, and he took the phone out of the room and said, 'Can you buy me Barbie Rapunzel? But can you please hide it, because if Mummy and Daddy find it, they're going to take it away.'" And I realised that I was shaming my child and their toy choices, and the toy embargo stopped. But I went to my GP because I was lost and I did not know what to do. And she raised her eyebrows and she went, "Ooh, that's interesting," which wasn't really very helpful because I was hoping for some direction. And then she wasn't the first, and she certainly wouldn't be the last person to tell me that it was a phase. It's quite a long one by now, wouldn't you say? And that she would grow out of it. But she didn't. And what happened was she kept reiterating, "I'm a girl, I'm a girl, I'm really a girl." 6 years old, she asked me when she could have the operation to make her a girl.
There's some clear retcon activity going on, isn't there, about the, what the backstory was. I mean, it's frankly, as a mum of 3 children, I find it absolutely astonishing that she's making something up about a 4-year-old having all of these insights. God made a mistake. It's just utter nonsense that they would have some insights about an operation and all the rest of it. At that age, it's just bonkers.
And it took me a while to sort of pluck up the courage. I waited until the evening when, it was quiet, nobody else was around, so I could make the call without kind of feeling that, I was under scrutiny. But it was.
So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about mermaids, because if you're on Twitter and but mermaids is just like a support group, really, isn't it? There's no medical side to it. You don't just prescribe anything. I just get this out the way right now because I know people will have that.
I can give you the official line. Okay, it's an advocacy organisation for gender variant and transgender youth, helping gender diverse kids, young people, and their families since 1995. That's the official.
So I think what really concerns me here is Susie Green said that she could make the call without scrutiny, which is really quite interesting. And I also think Susie Green is now presenting herself almost as someone who came to the organisation not as a layperson, but as someone who had actually experience in the topic, as someone who came with a particular agenda, a particularly more militant agenda than Mermaids at the time when she approached them had. And this is quite interesting because if you listen to Susie Green, both in her TED Talk and other media interviews, she actually presents a very different picture. And the picture she presents is of someone who is very much a member of the laity on trans issues. She had no idea what was going on. And yet here she seems to have a very clear idea of what's going on and a very clear idea she wants to present without scrutiny, which I think is of real concern.
Tish, what was your thought?
It's worth pointing out that if you look at the history of mermaids, from their very earliest coverage, I've got a screenshot where they openly say that actually most children with gender incongruous will grow up to be gay. That was the early line, predating Susie Green.
And I also think it's very important to note that this is an instance that we will come back to later in this video. Susie Green explicitly agrees with Freda Wallace that there is absolutely no medical role or advisory role or clinical role played by mermaids. This is something that we know from the investigation by Hannah Barnes and others not to be true. In fact, we know it is heavily evidenced that Susie Green had a direct line to clinicians at the Tavistock, including the most senior clinicians and heads of service provision. So that doesn't seem to stack up. But I think it's very interesting that she said this here, because as she goes on, this will not become coherent at all with her general position.
I think that was one of the most startling bits in Hannah Barnes' book, actually, for me, the level of access that they had, actually. And I would highly recommend, if people haven't read it, that they go and have a look at Hannah Barnes' book on this very point.
You know, I was part of the 2016 stakeholder group that looked at the service specification for the Tavistock, which is a gender identity service for children and young people. And so, you know, we were engaged. We we talked to the Tavistock on behalf of our service users. We represented them with regards to issues that they were, experiencing. We, we were supporting thousands of people by this point.
Yeah. Was there a massive increase in the number of people who were coming to the charity?
Yeah.
It was a big
increase. We saw it just go up and up. And you sometimes wonder, did it go up and up because we actually put more resource into it as we got, we managed to secure some grants to get some additional staffing that then meant we could train up volunteers. So was it because people then started to find out about us? But then I think the thing that really drove people to us was the very thing that, like the press attacks. So the first press attack was in 2017.
Yeah.
And immediately following each of the attacks against us, we saw our service user base grow. Yeah. Because people might not have known, because they became aware. And so because we were the only ones that they were going after.
I think one of the very interesting things here is that Susie Green is immediately contradicting herself regarding the role of Mermaids. Mermaids was obviously representing individuals on clinical matters with their issues within the services. So that was Susie Green representing individual service users on a clinical basis. So therefore, her earlier suggestion that they had no involvement is also nonsense. Also, she was involved in the service specifications as well, which de facto, if she's been consulted on service specifications, that means that she's adopting positions on clinical matters.
I find that highly, highly unusual. As someone who's written many service specifications over the year, I was astonished when I read that in Hannah's book. And they're still doing it now. Obviously, in the new service specifications, they're still managing to get their needs met and widen their way into, what they want.
So, but I think it was 2018-ish, somewhere around there. You were getting a huge amount of money from them. I think it was $500,000 in funding.
Over 5 years. So it was 100,000 a year. 100,000 a year over 5 years. So I started applying in April of 2018. Spoke to the grant manager. We went through you go through so much in terms of protocol, due diligence, all of that. So by the time we got to the beginning of December, and I was told at the beginning of December, I think like 5th or 6th, that we'd got through, that we'd got the money. And the team was still quite small then. There were only, I think, about 7 of us. And it was just this I don't know, this huge relief that we were getting this support to be able to expand our training, which increased our trading, which means that obviously brought additional income into the organisation. It gave us paid for 3 trainers and service facilitator salaries. So it added to the resource for us to support people as well. So we were like ecstatic. Oh, and it paid for a researcher as well.
I mean, so 100 grand at that time was probably, a huge chunk of annual budget. I mean, what other kind of, sources of funding did Mermaids have at that time?
So we had a Children in Need grant as well. We had some smaller grants like Garfield Weston. I can't remember whether Henry Smith were funding us back then, but they were fairly quickly afterwards. Paul Hamlin Foundation as well, one of the first funders that supported us. So there was quite a lot in terms of different small streams of money. We also got a reasonable amount of money in individual donations. So from people go on our website and they donate, and the best donations, as always, are the ones that are recurring donations, so that you can actually plan and see how much money you're going to get in, so that you can use that and planning and budgeting.
donated myself and to Vicky. I'll tell you about the circumstances of that later, but I have donated myself.
I had to twist her arm with one. We'll talk about that in a bit. So this funding was put under review, wasn't it? Because the charity came under a lot of anti-trans activist criticism.
Well, what happened was we got news of the actual grant being made, and then it's announced, so they put it up on the lottery website.
Yeah.
And Graham Linehan, writer, Father Ted, and all-round sort of hater of trans people in general,
Yes.
went on Mumsnet, which I call Prosecco Stormfront. That's not my line. Somebody else gave me that, and I've stolen it. But basically went on Mumsnet and told everybody on Mumsnet, put like literally the CEO of the lottery's email address, and said everybody must complain. Mermaids cannot get this money. Oh my God, they're gonna. I mean, I think he said something like they're going to open a clinic and trans more kids. I mean, you know, Mermaids did not get involved in medical pathways. We would tell people what was available, but we don't. You know, but
just support charity at the end of the day.
I found it really revealing, actually, that she was willing to reveal so much, you know, private, commercially sensitive information. That was the first thing that jumped out at me.
I think what really jumped out at me was Mermaids does not involve itself in medical decisions. About just a few minutes ago, it was very involved in medical decisions to the point it was representing patients to the service, and Susie Green herself was providing feedback on service specifications as an expert, despite having obviously no clinical background. That's really interesting. That's very revealing. You see, this is kind of, I now think we should really call Susie Green's Mermaids, as it was, Schrodinger's clinic, because it's both not a clinic and a clinic at the same time. And you have to open up the Mermaid service specifications to find it's worse than a clinic because it's incompetent and it's actually giving the advice. So it's something completely different. But it really is Schrodinger's clinic at the moment. I mean, it's whatever suits Susie Green's line of argument in the individual moment.
I just want to say something about the funding from the National Lottery Foundation. I think it would be worthwhile doing a deep dive into how much money has come from the National Lottery Foundation and Children in Need and Comic Relief, because they turn up quite a lot in my investigations. And the other thing is the Paul Hamlin Foundation. I had occasion to look at them because I was puzzled as to why The Guardian was so bad on the issue of women and sex-based rights. And when I looked, the Scott Trust oversees The Guardian, and they have hiring and firing power over the editor. And at the time that I looked at them, they shared a trustee with the Paul Hamlin Foundation, who, of course, when I went to look at them, they were funding Mermaids and Gendered Intelligence. So that was an interesting crossover. And she also mentions Henry Smith. They also crop up a lot in my post where I'm looking at the money and who's funding which groups.
Also, I think another thing to note here is the sheer disdain Susie Green has for women who are concerned about children. Prosecco Stormfront, really? Really? Also, I mean, it's just trivialization of Nazism, to be perfectly honest, in the far right. It's something we see frequently with Susie, but I really think it's quite dangerous to liken a bunch of very concerned parents who are going through a hellish time. You know, people who Susie Green you think might have some empathy for, to liken them to Stormfront, a neo-Nazi organisation, is just utterly unbearably wild. And to think that this individual was ahead of a major charity when making such comments is quite disturbing.
In fact, we are sparing our audience from much sneering. So, you know.
We listen so you don't have to.
Yeah, exactly.
But essentially, I got a phone call. I was walking my dogs. 17th of December it was. I was walking my dogs and I got a phone call from the grant manager saying, I'm really sorry, but we're just going to have to suspend your grant. And I was like, you did all the due diligence. You know all of this. And we've been attacked in the press before. And they were just like, no, we're sorry. You know, and when they sort of talked to us later, you know, they said that they get like, I don't know, an email or two a month saying, you know, we don't want that hostel building anywhere near my back garden, you know, but literally they had hundreds.
It was a pile.
They said both for and against, you know, so they So they were like, yeah, we can't just ignore this because of the volume of the. I just don't think they were prepared for it. They didn't know what to do.
So
yeah,
it's too hot to handle for them, obviously. Yeah.
Just before Christmas.
Do you have to get lawyers involved?
We did, yeah. We had some support from some legal experts around what was going on, because it's obviously such a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
But also because again, it was just a load of nonsense. You know, child sex change charity.
I mean, yeah. I mean, even I mean, it's none of their business at the end of the day, because they try to make out they're doing something to protect children, but there's nothing in their words that does that, and it actually harms people. So what the front is always, oh, we've got to protect the children, but that is always the front of the right wing. That is always the front that we've got to protect the family, we've got to protect the status quo, we've got to protect the children, is a common trope among very authoritarian and puritanical power structures. And unfortunately,
it's the playbook of 30 years ago when they were trying to roll back gay rights.
Yeah, well, we see it happening. We see it happening right now.
Yeah. Same headlines. You just like literally take out gay and put in trans, and I mean, like literally to the point where the headlines are pretty much identical. So
they're just. I mean, there are certain groups of people, like lobby groups. If there's a subject in politics, like say they're gonna something about fox hunting, they'll run a load of stories about why foxes are going to bite your children. And those stories are paid for by, Westminster-based lobby groups and think tanks, because they want people to be frightened of something. So whenever a vote comes up about, climate change or anything like that, they get to work on climate skeptics. It's always the same people. I'm sure you know who they are. I'm not going to mention any names, but if I mentioned the Policy Exchange, you might know who I mean. But it's always
come on, safe Tufton Street as well. That's the other one.
And it's like it's amazing how mad this makes people. It's amazing how angry people get. But I think it becomes.
And the thing is, it's not their kids.
I know.
It's none of their business. They're talking about other people's children, and what they're saying is they know better than those parents of those children.
Yeah, and they assume that
ludicrous.
And it's ludicrous. It's this assumption that the parents are harming their own children. I mean, I'm sure there are cases in the world. If you look deep enough, you would find cases of parents who are not doing the best for their children. But if you're looking in a trans direction, you're sort of looking the wrong way, aren't you?
Obviously, I am one of those parents. And it's interesting that I don't know best for my child, according to the likes of Mermaids. They know best for my child. And in fact, they're pushing all this propaganda into schools, grooming our children behind parents' backs, because we are the safeguarding risk, and we are allegedly harming our children by just wanting them to wait and not take irreversible medications at a young age.
I think it's very fundamentally clean and transparent that none of them actually understand what safeguarding is, and that it's every adult's responsibilities. And clearly none of them have ever had a job working with children or received any particular training. Freda always talks about this authoritarian and puritanical playbook that they always go to. And then obviously we always have to dig out, Tufton Street and the Policy Exchange. It's just like, this is what's always applied across any premise. But essentially, this issue around safeguarding is something that we always come back to. And it's very clear to me in all of the things that Mermaids got up to, that they really fundamentally did not and do not understand what safeguarding is all about.
I totally agree with that. Sorry, Tish, go ahead.
I was going to say that the other thing to remember is one of the Tavistock whistleblowers, one very haunting quote that I have from one of the articles was one of the clinicians who'd left the Tavistock said that the one case that really haunted her was a father who was pushing for puberty blockers for his little girl. And she always thought the pushing wasn't coming from the child. So what was the father's motivation for wanting to preserve his daughter in a pre-pubertal state? And she did say my fear was always that his motives were paedophilic.
And I think that that's also one of the very sinister motivations. The other one was, and I don't know if you remember this, Tish, one of the whistleblowers at the Tavistock said to the LGB Alliance, at the LGB Alliance conference, they said, and I thought this was very, very disturbing, that they didn't want a son who minced, but they wanted a daughter who ran. That was extremely disturbing. And again, I think it's very interesting that Susie Green is stuck in 2017. Let's do the time warp with Susie Green, because her arguments haven't moved on. This is just like gay rights. Well, I'm afraid gay rights don't demand you mutilate your children to be pure. I'm afraid allowing your child to grow up gay does not involve irreversible puberty blockers, hormones, or surgery. But I think one of the most interesting things here is Susie Green going Kel Harur, almost having a faint, grabbed the smelling salts at the reference to Mermaids being a child sex change charity. Oh, how horrifying Susie is. You know, she seems utterly aghast at this suggestion that an organisation which promotes gender-affirming care and surgery to minors as a policy position of what should occur might be referred to as a child sex change charity. Well, what else is it? I mean, to be honest, it's actually a pretty dead-on-the-nail summation of what mermaids are. It's what mermaids believe in. It's what mermaids promote. Mermaids have consistently been saying that this surgery should be provided to those who are under the age of 18, and therefore they are children in law. So they are a child sex change charity. That is exactly what their aims are. And they don't seem to have shifted even currently from that position. So Susie Green seems to be going, oh, but we're not this. Again, it seems to be mermaids is whatever Susie Green wants it to be, which is a real concern. It doesn't actually seem to have any coherent platform.
I think there was also a higher than average prevalence of convicted sex offenders amongst parents of attendees at the JIDS, which was an anomaly which was discussed as far as I can remember.
I've also got a clip from one of the Tavistock whistleblowers. He was a gay man who worked there, and he was very explicit that he was concerned that GIDS were ignoring bullied gay kids, and that was the reason for their distress, and that they were ignoring that and not pursuing it. And in actual fact, I've got another paper that is actually called it's about peer pressure and the fact that homophobic bullying can result in gender identity disturbance.
Other charities, including Stonewall, began raising funds to appeal the awarding of charitable status to LGB Alliance, describing the group's activities as, degenerating trans people. So could you just talk a little bit around what was going on with that, LGB Alliance? And I think they tried to do something to mermaids as well. I don't remember exactly what it was now.
To be honest, the LGBA just constantly went after mermaids, constantly went after me. The sort of discourse that was on Twitter, social media, etc. The sort of things that they were saying about what we were as a charity, talking about us transing, basically, making kids be trans because you're a homophobe and don't want a gay kid.
Yeah, exactly.
And that
we're rubbish. Yeah.
So as if. So this was going on for a long time. They started up, and we immediately started to see this stuff. And they managed to get stories in the papers and things because, the papers ate up anything that was anti-trans that they can put like a controversial spin to.
Well, they're very well connected, aren't they? So
yeah. So we saw all of this, and then they applied to be a charity. And we were like, no, they're never going to get charitable status.
I mean, they don't do any charitable work. They do no charitable work.
No charitable work.
So has that been resolved? I don't think it's been resolved yet, has it, that case?
So the court case itself was sort of like towards, I think, like the last hearing I went to was just at the very, very beginning of November, which is the last couple of days. And so the judgment, we're waiting for the judgment to be handed down by the courts, by the judges, as to whether or not they will. So it was mermaids with Good Law Project funding, taking the Charity Commission to court for giving LGBA status charitable status. So we
And
didn't
they
sue
really
the
came for you there.
LGBA, so we didn't sue the LGBA. We sued the Charity Commission for giving them charitable status.
Right.
And like lots of evidence was given, and honestly, I was in the courtroom and they just tried to use it as a speaking point about the things that they did, rather than the problems that they had with organisations such as Mermaids and Stonewall, etc., without actually talking to the points that we raised, which were, you're not a charity, you don't do any charitable stuff, you shouldn't be given. And the only things you do are based around degenerating others.
So there's no charitable action.
Well, I mean, even within that category of LGB, they don't actually, because I volunteer for the LGBT Foundation. They work with the homeless people, they work with drug and alcohol rehabilitation, we work in counselling services and signposting to. Well, I've never seen LGB do anything for the lesbian, gay, or bisexual community.
I can't think of anything that they've done.
I've had a shit disco once or twice in London. I think that's what they've done.
They have an annual conference and they invite a few dinosaurs. That's all they do.
That was that. But you see, because there's such. I mean, they're so easy to catch out. When they're trying to be. They try and be moral, they have the moral high ground, but all you have to do, it's very simple. All you have to do is comment and then wait for their followers to reply to you, and that proves that they're not followed by anybody that cares about anything apart from hate. So
it's a bit disingenuous for them to claim that LGB Alliance don't do any charitable work. Various lobby groups, as we saw from the Denise Farmy case against the Arts Council, they blocked a grant that was offered to LGB Alliance to make a documentary about older gay men called Queens. And that film went ahead. I think it was timed for the anniversary of one of the Queen's anniversaries, but unfortunately she actually died. So that they made that film, even though the funding had been withdrawn, and that's been subject to a court case involving an Arts Council employee who challenged the withdrawal of that grant to the LGB Alliance. That's one thing. They have also got money to scope setting up a helpline. And again, lots of their activities have been derailed because they've had to raise a huge amount of money and put a lot of effort into resisting this court case to strip LGB Alliance of their charitable status, which subsequent to this interview, it actually failed.
What's quite interesting about this entire dialogue, I mean, aside from Vicky and Freda calling women dinosaurs and older gay people dinosaurs, I thought we were meant to respect the people who fought for their rights and fought for our rights. But no, apparently not. Apparently you're all old dinosaurs, which is particularly egregious, I think, to describe people who have been fighting in this movement in such a way. But also, to further what's been said here, the LGBT Alliance is also continually lobbying, not just on really important gay health issues, in particular the provision of sexual health services. Also, it's looking at sex in the census. It's also been lobbying and supporting campaigns such as Justice for Alison, that's Alison Bailey, who received terrible treatment by Garden Court Chambers. I mean, I think when you're looking at this entire situation, to say that they are not a charity, I agree with Tish, is not just disingenuous, but we also have to look at this entire fact that Susie Green says the LGBT Alliance went after Mermaids. Who was the individual that brought that brought the LGBT Alliance to court? Was it Mermaids?
I think that's a really important clarification right off the bat, because essentially there's a bit of a slight play on words there, wasn't there? Because she really made it sound like it was the other way around. I think that's an important clarification.
And also, I think as well, when Susie Green is talking about what Mermaids do and then what LGBT Alliance does, Mermaids is doing everything at all times at any point. However, the corollary of that is that LGBT Alliance are only ever doing evil things, but then they don't actually do anything at all, and all they do is go after her. It's furthering the martyr complex, to be perfectly honest, which I don't think is in any way credible. further to that, and I think it's really important that we note this, Susie Green seems astonished that the LGB Alliance were granted their charitable status in the first place. And that's on the basis that they're political. You can see that in what she's saying. Well, mermaids have met with government ministers, and they make they make no apologies for doing so. Mermaids repeatedly lobby other organizations and make no apologies for doing so. So what we're really seeing here is an individual who's saying it's fine for me, but not for thee. And I don't think that has any credibility. In particular, another thing I would point out about this is that when they are denouncing the LGB Alliance, the LGB Alliance is the new kid on the block. And it has, from its outset, seen reports to the Charities Commission from the very outset, often very malicious reports. But equally, even despite doing that, it is actually taking up the mantle that other organizations should be doing. So, for example, the LGB Alliance has been promoting stories and news about prides in countries and individuals in countries who do not have rights yet, such as Uganda. And the LGB Alliance has been extremely promoting that, not just in a political sphere, but also in a public arena, about those who do not have rights yet. So to be quite honest, it seems that the LGB Alliance is upholding the mantle of a gay rights organisation in the way that obviously Stonewall has failed to, and Mermaids never had.
And it's worth pointing out as well that when Susie Green talked about LGB Alliance was subject to an enormous amount of scrutiny by the Charity Commission in order to get their charitable status. So it's not that it was clearly a very difficult decision for the Charity Commission because they anticipated a backlash. So they published a huge report explaining why they'd granted charitable status to LGB Alliance.
I think also to come in there, one of the more interesting things about what Freda said was that Freda said that the LGB Alliance, the test of whether they should be a charity or not, is whether what their followers say. Well, I do hope that Freda read the judgment, because that is explicitly dismissed. And I think more importantly, when you often look at the posts the LGB Alliance make, you often are immediately confronted with a wall of extremely vitriolic posts that are unhinged and deranged. So using Twitter as a bellwether of whether an organization should be a charity because of people who may support it, I think is particularly poor and obviously has no basis in law. So I would encourage Freda to actually read the court judgment.
And of course, they've, as you say at the start, they've spent their new charity, they've spent all of their time really being snowed under with this case. And obviously this was recorded before the judgment came out, which Mermaids lost. And the judgment was, Robbie?
Well, the judgment was that Mermaids had no standing. And that meant that, of course, Mermaids couldn't actually... obviously, as Mermaids say, they would have won the case if they had actually won the case, which we will all just laugh at, because it's like saying you would have won the 100-meter hurdles if you didn't fall at the first one. So let's just laugh at Mermaids on that basis. I will say one on a humorous note for all the people listening in. I do hope you are at this moment trying to picture Susie Green's face as the news that Mermaids lost came through. I think it would have been a very pretty picture. But on that note as well, I think it's very important that we note on the court verdict here that Mermaids provoked this, but yet Mermaids are angry about press scrutiny. For example, you have Mermaids trying to launch an entire campaign against the LGB Alliance, and yet we heard just minutes previously that Susie Green was saying, oh, it's disgraceful when they have stories, but it's absolutely wonderful when there's stories about us, but we want stories about them. Again, it's more, this is not good enough for me, but I will treat any other individual by this standard, which is just unacceptable, to be perfectly honest. And I think that everyone can now see the glaring double standard.
I wonder if she came along to our massive Twitter space that we ran celebrating the victory of LGBT.
She did actually. She popped in very briefly, but I'm afraid she didn't stay for long. I wonder if it was a lot of the commentary from some very angry lesbians and gay men who were very annoyed. And that's something else, I think, to say. and I want to say this as someone who's been to the LGB Alliance conference 2 years in a row, and I'm planning to go for a third year. It's absolutely amazing as a younger gay person to go along and sit there and meet people who are LGB and have been at the forefront of fighting for our rights, who have been constantly fighting in struggles, have been running prides for the first time in their local area years ago, have been beat up by the police, some of us were telling us, for their sexuality, who were thrown out of their home back in the 80s for their sexuality. So I'd rather spend time with the dinosaurs, to be quite honest. The dinosaurs are a lot cooler than
I've already bought my ticket, so you better get onto that. So let's move on to Jacob Breslow, which was a very interesting little bit of commentary that came up.
J.K. Rowling transphobic. I'll tell you what, follow the hashtag I stand with J.K. Rowling and come back to me.
So I think around this time, when this kind of case was going on, we started to see, like, in quick succession, negative things in the press about mermaids. All of a sudden, I don't know where it came from, but there was a story in the Daily Telegraph about chest binders. I'll let you talk about that if you want. And then there was also another story about Jacob Breslow and the London School of Economics.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk about those two topics?
Yeah. So basically, the Telegraph started going after us on the 23rd of September, 2022. So I was actually on holiday and started getting notifications from people who were like, okay, so the Telegraph are going to write a piece. They generally write to you first, tell you what, give you a little bit of an overview and say, would you like to respond? Right. So I was dealing that with whilst I was away on holiday. Then the pieces started to appear, and they basically had a young person phone up and pretend to be trans to try and get a chest binder. And I mean, like, chest binders are not prohibited wear. You can buy them off Amazon. You literally can buy them off Amazon. Yeah.
See, what I would say is that if you're buying something that's specifically made for that purpose, well, it's a safe thing to buy. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, they're coming to you. It's because they trust you. It'd be better to come to you.
We didn't sell them. We provided them free of charge. So, like Spectrum and GTB, they used to donate binders to us. Yeah. And we would then speak to, and it was mainly the parents that we supplied binders to. So low-income families, they couldn't afford to buy a couple of binders for their kids, or they just weren't sure about what best to do. I mean, so they'd come to us, and we would think
about the alternative to buying a proper binder. It's doing something homemade yourself. So what's better to do?
We've heard of kids literally ripping out their armpit hair because they literally wound duct tape around themselves. Their damage done. To their skin, and also too tight, not, the restrictions, the problems. I mean, it just doesn't bear thinking about it. So it was really sort of on a harm reduction basis. And also, let's be really clear, young people who wear chest binders do so because it gives them more confidence when they've got them on.
And it's also this dichotomy in the trans argument. I always say, as far as transphobes are concerned, if you're under 16, you're a victim of your parents, and if you're over 16, you just, we just hate you anyway because you're trans. So where is that line? They suddenly stop caring about you when you're 16. The fake concern stops when you hit 17, does it? Because no, the thing they hate, the thing they can't stand, is the fact that people are free to express themselves, and that's powerful. And if you want to help, and because you're there to help with that, and to reduce harm. They can't see it any other way. They in their minds, they can only see it as a pure innocent child that had been forced to do this thing, which obviously is obviously the opposite of the case. Because by the time somebody goes to a gender service or anything like that, they've probably been talking to their parents about it, as your daughter was, for many years. So it's all made up nonsense, isn't it?
And also, it's not their bloody business.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's none of their business. Whether this is not their kid. This is not their business. It doesn't make any difference to them whatsoever. you know, there are much bigger issues out there that they could really focus on that would make a difference to. But you know, let's talk about male violence. Let's talk about domestic violence. Let's talk about, you know, that they use trans issues as wedge issues. Let's talk about reproductive rights and body autonomy, but they're not.
I just want to tell everyone who's listening, there's a great irony in Susie Green discussing reproductive rights, because that's what her organisation has been denying so many children on such a terrible basis.
And of course, that will link in nicely to a little discussion about puberty blockers in a little while. This issue about binders not being harmful, look, there's no regulation about binders. They are harmful. You know, just the fact that they're on Amazon and that you can buy them cheaply or from these organizations, you know, has literally no bearing on the fact that they are actually harmful. They are causing, in some cases, rib fractures, back pain. These are not safe, healthy things for young girls to be using. I mean, it's utterly infuriating to hear these people talking so flippantly in this way about medical matters.
I'd just like to point out that I've got some research into the harms for breast binding, and they're actually quite extreme. So I will provide that clip for you to include that. And I would just also say there's a complete mismatch in our guidance, because we know that breast ironing is known as a safeguarding risk. That's, I think it's even in police guidance. So why are we not pointing out the harms that breast binding do? It almost seems a little bit racist. What you do overseas is because you're ignorant and backward. So we're going to make sure we scrutinise any child who's in danger of being removed for breast ironing treatment, and yet we ignore the risks of breast binding.
Furthermore to that, there's also a really interesting comment that Wallace makes that Green agrees with, which is if they're not receiving binders, they're going to go and find the most harmful way to bind their chest possible. Again, this is what they're doing with this choice. It's the same thing we see with, do you want a live child or a dead child? Mm. This is exactly what we're seeing. Well, if your child doesn't get a binder, they're going to go and get barbed wire from the nearest power substation and bind their chest bit. This is nonsense, because actually the alternative here is that perhaps the child gets serious, rigorous psychiatric assessment and care for a problem in which they loathe and despise their own body, which perhaps is a sign of other serious conditions and serious comorbidities that need to be examined. But yet again, to them, it's obviously, if you don't do this, your child will do this. It is totally a sales pitch. And to be fair to Green, she's quite good at that sales pitch. She's been doing it for a considerable while. But the problem is she's not actually engaging with any scientific evidence on this issue. And she's not actually well briefed in it either, which I think is a really interesting concern. And all I would say, as for Freda and Vicky kind of nodding along here, it's very, very, very easy for individuals who have repeatedly in public said that they would like breasts to dismiss young girls who have gone through a puberty that these two individuals will never, ever go through at any stage, for them to dismiss that serious concern, that serious body. Though I will never understand that as a man. That's something that only you two ladies will understand. So for these two men to be sitting there saying the only alternative is that they will do this to themselves is a severe misunderstanding, and it comes from a place, and I would say, of male entitlement.
I think that the lack of evidence base and attention to looking for any is a theme throughout all of their commentating. And Susie Green especially is someone who is lacking insights on any intellectual rigor, and I think that that's particularly evident when she goes on to talk about the GRA and you know what's happening in Scotland, etc., puberty blockers, all of it really. But I think what is particularly egregious for me in this one example is the level of emotional manipulation that she's levying for parents, because if they stumble upon this again, this manipulation for what do you want, an alive child, a dead child, for this, what do you want, your kid to gaffer tape themselves up to the 9 or, you know, to use something nice and legitimate from Amazon, which clearly has no harm. For that, I find it actually difficult to contain my rage, really.
Agreeing with the policy on trans issues, and they go for these people, and then they're funded by sometimes the speech union, Toby Young's Free Speech Union, and they create these stories. There was no story, but because they're willing to throw money at somebody, they'll create the story, and the story it's just the fact that they can manufacture a story is what is the motivation for that. And obviously the motivation is some kind of authoritarian idea of identity. And I think that's why
it's clickbait, you know,
it makes a lot of money.
Make some money in terms of advertising.
Yeah, the money side.
As well as that, Victoria, you mentioned Jacob Breslow.
Yeah.
Okay. So Jacob Breslow had come on board as a trustee at the end of July.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started going after us in September. So what we knew that there was a lot of digging going on into staff, into volunteers, etc. We also were aware that there were stories all over the dark web. So Kiwi Farms had lots of stories of, you know, lots of things being written about members of staff, me. They put my house, pictures of my house and like my address online, and pictures of my dog and my kids and the kid's dad. And, you know, there was so much speculation about we're doing this, we're doing that, whatever. And whilst these Telegraph pieces were coming out, so we had to, obviously, if you get a load of negative press, you have to report it to the Charity Commission. So I raised what's called a serious incident report with the Charity Commission to say, we're getting a load of negative press. This is what it's all about. We've obviously dealt with the binders with you before, but this has become extra nasty because of this FGM, like simile that they created.
Yeah.
But we told them about it. Then what happened is the story about Jacob broke. So Jacob contacted us and said, this happened a long time ago that he went to this conference, and he since found out that the people he went to the conference for were like paedophile apologists. Apparently, you know, that's that you can't say it any. Anyways, they talk about having, you know, really minority attracted adults, and I'm like, that is just grim.
Yeah.
And
they're trying to associate you with that.
So as soon as we knew, and as soon as we saw the stuff, and Jacob resigned immediately, and he went, I don't want to, like, you know. But I was cross because we asked explicitly people, have you got anything that could damage the charity? And I'm pretty sure he knew that could have been used against us, and he didn't tell us.
Things like that.
I mean, I can only hypothesize.
Things like that, you know, going to a conference wouldn't come up in a background check anyway, would it? I mean,
no. I mean, we do. All of our trustees, all of our staff, all of our volunteers have enhanced DBSs.
Yeah. So the way I look at it is, you know, as soon as you find out about something like that, you take action, and that's exactly what you did. So
we did totally talk to him straight away. He like literally said, "I'll resign" straight away, and we were like, "Yeah, you should."
This is quite staggering, but it's also incredibly important, and it's also very odd. She's being disingenuous, I think, here, because she's saying that, you know, we ask people about things that might come up and might damage the charity, but essentially what she's saying is that Jacob Breslow just casually happened to go to a conference one day, and there was people in the audience who happened to be paedophile apologists, and clearly, you know, that wasn't that good. This is just not telling the whole story, is it? Because essentially, Jacob himself gave a talk which was around minor attracted people and paedophile apologia. It wasn't just that there was he sat in the audience and other people were there. Isn't that the case?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you. What I would say this is, and if both of you want to laugh, I would say this is very reminiscent of the Little Britain sketch with the minister who came outside with his wife and the kids. And then he says, yes, I accidentally ended up at a conference, which I wasn't meant to be at, presenting a presentation about redefining the sexuality of a paedophile that I hadn't written before, that was written by one of my researchers. And then accidentally, I found out everyone else in the room was also a paedophile apologist. It was very inconvenient, and it won't happen again.
Yeah,
that's genuinely what this was like. But let's be clear here about Jacob Breslow, because I think we actually have to quote his own research about how he says there should be major revisions on how paedophilia is defined, diagnosed and understood through a feminist and queer lens. And that's from his paper, Sexual Alignment, Critiquing Sexual Orientation, the Paedophile and the DSM-5.
Right.
For example, one of the things that Breslow says, and I think it's really quite alarming, is many tend to begin with the linkage of paedophilic desire to harmful and abusive relationships and acts, ending up in proliferating rather than questioning normative gendered and sexual intelligibility. Actually, I'm going to leave that in as he says in intelligibility. There we go. Yeah. And all I'll say to that is that's a very long way of saying what Peter Tatchell did in a certain Guardian article, that not all relationships between adults and children are harmful. So this is actually something that he wrote, and he wrote this in 2011, in August 17th, 2011. This is at the symposium of, and let me tell you, this was a brief description of a presentation at Paedophilia, Minor Attracted Persons and the DSM, Issues and Controversies. Oh dear, I actually ended up at Paedophilia, Minor Attracted Persons and the DSM, Issues and Controversies. But I had no idea they were talking about paedophiles.
And also the way, I mean, and she's going, I'm not really sure what it's called. I think is it something like minor attracted persons or something? Like she knows that they're trying to get this, steamroll this into the LGBTQ umbrella. You know, this is commonly known. And also it's worth also commenting that this guy is active in the RSE schools agenda, right? He's been writing materials for an organization called Schools Out. This guy is prolific. You know, he was a senior academic at LSE, the London School of Economics. This isn't a small fish. This is an important person.
No, and I think we have to go further than that as well, to actually examine how he himself, in this paper on sexual alignment and the paedophile, he himself went on to use the phrase minor attracted people. So this is not, you know, Susie Green frames it as, oh, well, you know, he was there with people who use that term. Jacob Breslow uses that term not only in his presentation, but actually in the text of his own documents that he has written and his own research. So the idea that, I accidentally ended up there is nonsense.
And it speaks to a lack of due diligence in a charity that's dealing with children. Because you could find, I've got a copy of Jacob Breslow's PhD. You can get it easily, publicly. Why did they not look? They know he's a researcher. They know he's got a PhD. Why did they not look? Get someone to do a search of his PhD, which you can find online.
And this isn't just someone with an academic interest. Let me read to you another part of the paper. Allowing for a form of non-diagnosable minor attraction is exciting. That is an exact quote. It is exciting, as it potentially creates a sexual or political identity by which activists, scholars, and clinicians can begin to better understand the minor attracted person. He's actually excited by it. He says that in his own words.
I raised what's called a serious incident report with the Charity Commission today. We're getting a load of negative press. This is what it's all about. We've obviously dealt with the binders with you before, but this has become extra nasty because of this FGM, simile that they created. But we told them about it. Then what happened is the story about Jacob broke. So Jacob contacted us and said, this happened a long time ago that he went to this conference, and he since found out that the people he went to the conference for were like paedophile apologists. Apparently, you know, that's that you can't say it any. Anyways, they talk about having, you know, really minority attracted adults, and I'm like, that is just grim. And are they trying to associate you with that? So as soon as we knew, and as soon as we saw the stuff, and Jacob resigned immediately, and he went, I don't want to, I was cross because we asked explicitly people, have you got anything that could damage the charity? And I'm pretty sure he knew that could have been used against us, and he didn't tell us. Things so, like that. I mean, I can only hypothesize.
things like that, going to a conference wouldn't come up in a background check anyway, would it? I mean,
no. I mean, we do all of our trustees, all of our staff, all of our board.
Literally comes up on Google, mate.
Yeah. So the way I look at it is, as soon as you find out about something like that, you take action, and that's exactly what you did. So
we did totally talk to him straight away. He literally said, "I'll resign" straight away, and we were like, "Yeah, you should."
It's like the same thing with the Tavistock and things like that. They were so desperate to find people to sue them, and they didn't find that. And they found, I mean, there were lots of failings there. Let's not beat around the bush, but they were mainly down to funding. And, like you said, there's a massive increase in demand. I think that was not helping. And obviously you have all this vexation going on in the background. But there was never, as far as I'm aware, there's never been a whistleblower who said there was something wrong with the treatment or care of children. There's never been any realistic complaint from any parent. And if there had been, we'd know about it, because there are people out there that are digging so hard for this stuff that it would definitely be on the front page of the Daily Mail if anything like that happened. We can always guarantee.
But there is, actually. So there are a couple of studies that have been done with parents and young people who attended the Tavistock. But what the newspapers want to sell you is this story that kids are being fast-tracked. They've been given drugs within 5 minutes of getting there. They're being trans. That basically they've been put down a route that makes them trans at the end of it. They're not allowed. They're basically being fast-tracked down down a route that means that they can't change their minds, etc. The truth of the matter is that actually it's the opposite. There's studies that show that actually the way that children and young people were treated within the Tavistock was very much about prove you're trans. How trans are you?
Yes.
Trans girls told that they weren't wearing the right. They turned up in jeans and they were told off because you're not trying hard enough.
Oh dear.
Yeah, there was some some really disturbing stuff in terms of these two studies by Cal Horton. So if anybody wants to look them up.
Yeah, I will.
And I remember, because I went to the Tavistock with my daughter, and I remember that some of the things that were said to me, like, for example, one of the first appointments that we went into where we're talking, and they're like, what was your pregnancy and your birth flight, her birth flight? And I'm like, it's not got to do with anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But one of my
it was about trying to find a reason for them being trans. It was based on the fact that the Tavistock was based on psychotherapy.
It's astonishing that they can claim that there have been no whistleblowers. Anybody wants evidence of this? There is Matt Bristow, Kirsty Entwistle. They've used their own name. There's David Bell from the Tavistock. There's articles in the Times with quotes. There's the Sonia Appleby case, who was an employee who said that she was concerned about safeguarding. That's all in the public domain. So clearly they're in a little bit of a bubble and they're not looking at the sources because they're not convenient. But the fact of the matter is there have been whistleblowers. And now, of course, we've got the cast review and the closure of the Tavistock, which is known at the time of this interview.
I think also as well, we have to talk here about the serious incident being raised after Breslow, as if that's the only complaint that's been made against the charity, as if that's the only incident that has caused the statutory inquiry, which is actually a serious safeguarding inquiry, as we are well aware. One thing I would also say is it's unfortunate to have someone like, for example, say, Jacob Breslow slip through your very tight safeguarding net, of which you apparently ask them if they've done anything wrong, which I would say at a children's charity is not good enough, because quite frankly, a lot of people might want to go to a children's charity and go, oh, I've never done anything that could harm the charity, ever. But you have him with his easily Googleable pass. I mean, I found, put it this way, if you Google him, plus the term gender, which many people may just do who are interested in the topic, one of the first things that came up, even at the time that this was all breaking, was this speech to this symposium. So I don't buy it. But then you have Darren New, who Twitter affectionately known as Kaleidoscope, whose own pornography or pornographic photo shoot was in public domain under his own name. So how rigorous was the safeguarding and the checks at Mermaids? Because, okay, it might not show up in a DVB check, but what about a certain Google search for these individuals? just simple Google. I think it's very interesting that Freda Wallace raised that we would have heard about it on the front page of the Mail or any newspaper were there to be complaints from parents, which totally seems to ignore the fact that there have been multiple headlines throughout this year and last year about parents exploring legal action to take against the Tavistock and against multiple gender identity clinics, including Sandyford. This is actually front page news, but I don't think they're actually reading the papers. I mean, Pink News doesn't count, I'm afraid to say, for Vicky and Freda. But we have to also look here again at what Susie Green is saying and see if we can actually buy this. Susie Green is essentially trying to lead us down the path again about medical transition. Susie Green is saying that she had absolutely no part in this, and yet Susie Green was directly referring individuals. In fact, she herself was in contact with Dr. Polly Carmichael, who was the head of the service at the time. And she was ensuring that her referrals would go or be fast-tracked. So perhaps Susie Green is correct that they weren't handed out puberty blockers on first visit. However, the idea that there was no fast-tracking when she herself was directly involved in that fast-tracking, and that was known at the time of this interview, this came out in March, I think it was around the 27th of March, if I remember correctly, is for the birds. So Susie Green knew, and we know, that she was involved in fast-tracking. So why is she denying this? Why is she denying that there was any form of fast-tracking or referrals at the Tavistock? Again, she is Schrodinger's clinician. She's neither a clinician, but also performing the actions of a clinician and referring people at the same time.
There was a whole back catalogue of emails between her and Polly Carmichael, wasn't there? And interventions that she made where when GPs didn't agree to get involved, where she would, make some kind of intervention. And all of this is documented from the interviews that Hannah Barnes undertook, which is in her book, Time to Think, which clearly none of these three have read, but made it into every single national newspaper, I think, bar The Guardian, probably.
It's worth noting that Cal Horton, that Susie Green has just quoted, I've done a series on Cal Horton looking at the parents of trans kids, and it's very clear that those parents knew that if there was any reluctance on the part of their GP to prescribe, all they had to do was threaten to involve mermaids. And that's all documented in the public domain.
Yeah. Then we've got Miriam Cates, MP.
Oh, that little horror.
Using Prime Minister's questions time to, ask for a police investigation into mermaids. I'm not sure how you responded to that, but I think it was along the lines of,
"Hi, this is
here we go again. She's criticised us before."
And the thing is that it's not a police matter. In terms of what we do as a support charity, how on earth can that be a police matter?
Well,
it was just
basing that on the fact
publicity.
Yeah.
Negative publicity. It's a publicity stunt to try and discredit the charity, to try and raise questions about the charity, and this is all aimed at stopping people getting help. That's what it is.
This is another incident around the same time frame.
Well, I was going to say
at the end of those other incidents, and it's all too manufactured for me. You can see, you can almost taste the connections.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Miriam Cates to me is basically just Caroline Farrow with a bigger budget. And like when I listened to her in the House of, the parliamentary discussion about the meaning of sex, gender, whatever this thing that Sex Matters have created out of nowhere. She's like an evangelical. It reminds me of the Westboro Baptist Church. She'd be there with a placard saying, trans are going to hell. That's what I see when I see her. I see the pitch.
She was very much like that in that debate, wasn't she?
I tell you what, if Miriam Cates is standing there with a placard, I'm going to be standing right next to her with my placard. And I have to just say, I absolutely love Miriam Cates. She is epic. And I don't know what we would have done on the schools issue without Miriam Cates. She is brilliant, tenacious, fabulous.
All I'll say is that firstly, it's an insult to Caroline Farrow. I think really quite a nasty, almost classist, very strange sort of insult to throw out there. Also, again, shows that anything is fair game You know, when it comes to talking about women here who are involved in this discussion, anything's fair game. To call a woman who is an MP who is interested in the safeguarding of children and ensuring that they are not polluted with the most insane ideology and ideological misinformation and disinformation, to liken her to Westboro Baptist Church is absolutely insane. Again, this is something I think we should all know. These people have no grasp on reality anymore. I don't even know if they know what Westboro Baptist Church do, because Westboro Baptist Church actually are the organisation that protests veterans' funerals. So when a veteran is being buried in America, they come along with God hates fags, that sort of extreme hate speech. We're talking here, and as people will know, I'm not a massive fan of using that term, but this is put it this way, this is stuff that's anti-Semitic, it's homophobic, it is incredibly racist. And to liken Miriam Cates for saying that we should safeguard children to an organisation that pickets the funeral service people with smears against Jews, black people, and gay people is just out of control. And I have to say, the fact that Susie is sitting there with a smile on her face after hearing that really says it all.
I think it's, you know, everyone is fair game, because there's a lot, they'll smear literally every single person. But I think what's also interesting is that the power is obviously in their hands to do that. But if we sat here and made one single comment, because we are highly alert to the fact we cannot make any slippage, because we would be likely to be reported for it. I think that's just an interesting observation that I would just wish to, you know, lay down for the record anyway.
I met Helen Weatherly, I think in like 2015, I think it was. And she approached Mermaids, and I met for a cup of coffee, and we had a chat about she was providing adult trans healthcare, and she wanted to provide for young people as well. And the reason that she wanted to do that was because even back then there were still issues around waiting lists and time to get into services, etc., within the GID service, the Gender Identity Service for Young People. And so she wanted to follow the WPATH, which is the international guidance, like literally the global guidance that most service specifications are built on. And she wanted to work and support kids. And so I was like, this is great. Yeah, this is great, because, you know, the NHS, I think at that point, the NHS was still not providing blockers until 16. They changed fairly shortly afterwards, and then they did, but it was based on age. So it was 12 years old. You had to be 12 before you could get blockers. Now, then in 2016, the NHS moved to saying stage, not age. So they provided it at the Tanner stages of puberty, which was an improvement. But again, still, you know, waiting lists, still taking a bit of time, but nothing compared to what they're like now.
Can I just ask you about blockers, just for people listening? It's like, because we get this a lot, that people say it's not reversible, it's got fasting damage, side effects, all this kind of stuff. Can you just give us some information on what they actually do? And obviously, just for people who don't quite know what that blocker means.
Okay, so blocking medication, it's a GnRHA analog. So basically what it is it's a medication. It started being used for prostate cancer because it shut down the production of hormones. Right. So, and then it started being used for what's called precocious puberty in
I've heard about
cisgender children. So that's been done, I think, since the 1970s or maybe the beginning of the 80s. No, it's not a new medication, not very long. So what they used it for kids with precocious puberty is like your 4-year-olds starting a period, for example. You know, so kids who go into puberty like way, way too early, and they just give this blocking medication, stops the production of natal sex hormones, and then all they did was when they got to like reasonable age, 10 or 11, took away the blocking medication. And then within generally 3 to 6 months, but sometimes at the outside, it was a year, normal puberty resumed. So the blockers wore off, normal puberty resumed. Kids then started going through, continuing on their pubertal pathway. And so we've got adults with kids, and there's this thousands of people worldwide. It's been seen as being like the gold standard of treatment for precocious puberty. And it is reversible, because if not, then all of those cisgender kids who had blockers would not have continued on with their natal, their natal puberty. And if it made kids trans, which is the other thing that's said, all of those kids with precocious puberty would have decided they were trans, and
they would have had gender issues, wouldn't they? And we don't see that.
And we don't see that. That's just not happened.
I think when talking about hormones, because a lot of things that comes up with this irreversible thing is what they're actually talking about is side effects. And every medication has side effects. So if I was to look at a bottle of paracetamol now, and we should show you the list of things that could, if you showed that to somebody, oh my God, I'd never take paracetamol ever again. But because they have to list absolutely everything that could possibly in a million years go wrong, that's the kind of information that gets put out into the media about hormones and blockers, because there are side effects. But but I think that every medication does. So
there might be side effects, but I think when they're talking about irreversible, they're talking about surgeries, aren't they?
No. They're talking about the blockers, and they're talking about because to get surgeries, like I don't know in this country at the moment, if you'd have to go. I mean, I don't know what you'd have to do. You'd have to get like 3 doctors' signatures and all that kind of thing. So
depends what type of surgery. But essentially, blocking medication, hormone blockers, GnRH analog, is completely reversible. You stop it and puberty resumes. That's it.
The interesting thing about this is that there's a constant use of the precocious puberty, which is not without side effects. And there are people who've ended up with osteoporosis. And there have been multi-million lawsuits against Lupron in the States. But the other thing that they're not mentioning is that 98% of those children progress to cross-sex hormones. So it appears to lock in the pathway. It's not the same as somebody who stops the puberty and then lets it resume. We're blocking their puberty in its entirety. And you may have seen the quote from Marcy Bowers, who's a trans-identified male and also a surgeon who does gender reassignment surgery, inverted commas, and worked on Jazz Jennings. Marcy Bowers pointed out that if you put males, I'm just going to focus on males because that's what Marcy was talking about, on puberty blockers, followed by cross-sex hormones, they will have stunted genitalia. It will make the surgeries more complex. They will be unlikely to ever orgasm.
The second was an observation that I had, that every single child or adolescent who was truly blocked at Tanner stage 2 has never experienced orgasm. I mean, it's really about zero. These are just assigned male at birth, so trans feminine, and it's because they never in their lives are exposed to testosterone. That doesn't change. So blockers prevent the rise of testosterone, and they don't really go on testosterone at or around surgery or into adulthood. And so we don't know. They're going to have this sensation. There's no question about that. But are they going to be able to achieve sexual satisfaction? It's important in relationships. And I know that from my work with female genital mutilation.
And I've got the clip where they're saying that, so I can share that, so to confirm it.
I think that's so relevant, Tish, as well, because you also have to look at the clip of Susie Green and her mother engaging in the most ghoulish laughter when they talk about Susie Green's son, and they specifically talk about him not having enough to work with when creating his new genitalia, shall we say. And that's a very specific quote in which the pair of them laugh considerably. So again, here when we're looking at this, it's not something that has no side effects. It is in many ways irreversible. And Susie Green has actually laughed about that personally herself previously.
It's also worth pointing out that the original research on which, when the Tavistock began to introduce puberty blockers, which I think was 2011, the research that they were relying on actually had a teenage boy who'd had puberty blockers, had stunted genitalia, had to have more complex surgery. He died of necrotizing fasciitis.
He did.
As part of that study.
I think what's most egregious for me, from a clinical perspective, is that these three people giving like an extraordinary level of medical misinformation, and I feel myself feeling incredibly angry about that. So I'm actually going to cut in another video just to clarify these points and to point people to relevant studies, because there is no comparator between precocious puberty and puberty blockers, chemical castration being given for gender dysphoria, which I also don't believe in. But these two things are not the same. There is absolutely no evidence that puberty restarts when it's given further on. Precocious puberty, these chemical castration drugs would be given at the age of, say, 4 or 5. So they would be stopped at a point where when puberty wouldn't even, would start further on down the road. But the point being is that the evidence has been around for a long time, and they're just choosing not to look at it. In 2019, there was information evidenced. There was a really good paper by Michael Biggs talking about the harms that were being committed. He then obviously went on to completely debunk the De Vries study, which was the Dutch study. And I will cut in some short videos that he's done talking about this, because we can't be allowing this to stand and lying on the internet, because fundamentally what this was all about, the whole premise of this, was to try and stop young people from developing adult features, so they would basically look prettier essentially as adults and more feminized or more masculinized. And if you have a stunted penis, it doesn't suddenly start regrowing. If you've missed the window for your puberty development, you don't suddenly start growing it. What you are going to have is a stunted penis. So therefore, what happens is, like you just suggested with that sad case of that child who died, is that they will have to do some kind of fake genital surgery and use a bit of bowel for those I'm not going to call them vaginas, because they're not. The other thing that I wanted to say was we also now have enough information about the fact that these people will be fundamentally robbed of their sexual functioning as well as their fertility. We also think that there's sufficient information around their brain development and emotional development with regards to having been on puberty blockers. All of these things are a huge issue. And so it's absolutely irresponsible to sit there and say that these are harmless drugs and they're reversible. And also, a child of the age of 12, for instance, in no way can make a decision about signing off their sexual function for the rest of their life. I mean, that's just an abhorrent idea. Similarly, allowing an adult, a parent, to give away their child's sexual function. I mean, it should be a criminal offence, for God's sake. It's infuriating. And the other thing, sorry, just to finish off, Michael Biggs, who I absolutely love, and I'm really happy that he's done all of this work, and I give him full credit for all of that. But I'm unhappy that he thinks that it's okay for clinical trials to go ahead and for these drugs to be given in clinical trials. And that's where I have to, part ways with him in terms of his, understanding and, thoughts on puberty blockers. Go on, Tish, I've gone on a rant.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to make 2 points. One is that there was a court case in France. I think it went to the European Court of Human Rights, where an adult man who wished to identify as a woman won a case that said he couldn't be forced to go through gender reassignment surgery because it would effectively make him sterile. So why are we allowing and saying it's a human rights abuse for adults, but we're doing it to children? That's the first point. My second point is about brain maturation, because some of our teenagers have gone on these drugs in their teenage years, but we know that brain maturation takes till 25. So that's always been a residual concern for me on a personal level. On another level, in sentencing guidelines, we recognise that under 25s don't have full brain maturation, and therefore it can be taken into account when someone is convicted of an offence. So why are we protecting convicted criminals, but we're not protecting gender dysphoric, inverted commas, children?
And of course, the other thing is that, you know, we have this information about bone development and potential osteoporosis. And, you know, I don't know about you, but when you look at a lot of the these people on protests, etc., how many of them are disabled and using walking aids?
I've noticed that.
And I really am concerned for their morbidity and, you know, potentially mortality, given what we know about increased levels of strokes and coronary heart disease, etc. Robbie, did you want to say anything about puberty blockers?
No, I think you've covered it. I don't have a clinical background, so unlike Miss Green, I won't be commenting.
Can I just add one thing more? You may not know that I have multiple sclerosis. Now, because I'm a woman, I've only got relapsing remitting, which is not, you wouldn't know, so I'm not complaining about that. But the drugs, when you give synthetic hormones to males, they increase their risk of multiple sclerosis nearly times 7. Now, if you throw in a genetic predisposition from me, that really concerns me. And I've contacted the doctors who won't reply to me, but I said, you know that I have that. Are you looking and making sure that you're doing appropriate testing to make sure that there are no early symptoms? And I suspect they never even thought about it and they didn't know. And that makes me so angry. What's that phrase? First, do no harm.
Yeah, exactly.
Puberty blockers are a class of drugs, gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonists such as Lupron. These drugs stop the production of sex hormones. For males, these drugs achieve chemical castration, quite literally. But they've never been licensed to treat gender dysphoria. GnRHA can be administered from Tanner stage 2, which is the beginning of puberty. And so that could be a girl, for example, as young as 9 years old. Advocates for puberty blockers claim that this is analogous to treating precocious puberty. Precocious puberty is when, for example, a girl maybe age 5 might have started developing breasts. But that treatment means delaying a puberty that arrives abnormally early so that the child can undergo puberty at the normal age. By contrast, puberty suppression for gender dysphoria means stopping normal puberty in order to prepare the child to take cross-sex hormones for the rest of their life. Now, the only robust scientific evidence favoring this intervention comes from a longitudinal study of 70 Dutch teenagers. De Vries et al. In 2014 published outcomes shortly after surgery, so the patients were around the age of 20. Several psychological measures showed improvement, though these measures were taken for only a subset of patients, sometimes as few as 32 individuals. De Vries et al. Acknowledged that one patient was killed by necrotizing fasciitis during the vaginoplasty. That's a death rate exceeding 1%, which is incredibly high for a group of healthy teenagers. The death was actually a consequence of puberty suppression, as I'll explain a bit later. We lack any knowledge of the outcomes in the longer term, and this is for a treatment that has been going on for more than a quarter of a century. The only attempt to actually replicate the Dutch study came from the Gender Clinic in London, which you might know as the Tavistock. So they administered GnRHA to 44 teenagers. Because they found the results after 2 years weren't positive, the researchers decided not to publish the results. And as I said, my campaign eventually forced them to publish their research and revealed that puberty suppression didn't improve psychological functioning and didn't reduce gender dysphoria. There are now a handful of American longitudinal studies, but they're much worse in quality. For males, early puberty suppression makes subsequent genital surgery more risky. The penis is so undeveloped that a normal vaginoplasty is usually impossible. In this case, a portion of the intestine has to be used to line this newly created orifice. Leakage from the intestines immediately after surgery is what killed that first Dutch patient at the age of 18. Puberty suppression hinders the normal accumulation of bone mass. Up to 1/3 of teenagers who take GnRHA for 2 years end up with abnormally low bone density, putting them at risk of osteoporosis in later life. think even more serious are the unknown costs. All the evidence is that early puberty suppression, followed by cross-sex hormones, prevents the development of sexual functioning. Also unknown is the effect on emotional and cognitive development. It's remarkable that researchers have never studied the effect of puberty suppression on cognitive measures like IQ. I would argue that puberty suppression should only be offered in a proper randomized controlled trial.
Oh, can I just add one more thing to that?
Yeah, do.
Because I'm female, I'm more likely to get relapsing remitting. Males tend to have a significantly worse prognosis when they get multiple sclerosis, and we'll either get primary progressive or secondary progressive.
Yeah.
Now, how do we know that this is not going to be the case for males on the cross-sex hormones, that not only will they get it, but they'll get it a male pattern type?
Which is a very serious issue in terms of degeneration.
Just to also cut in there, if I can, about the case, because I want to give people the information regarding the case that Tish rightly cited. So that is AP Garçon de Nico v France. And in that case, and that was decided on April 6, 2017, the European Court of Human Rights essentially said that there was 2 transgender applicants and they were required to undergo, obviously, either a sex change operation, to call it that if we wish, or sterilizing treatment in order to correct their sex designation, to therefore receive an updated birth certificate. And the court ruled that it was actually a violation of Article 8, which is their right to private life, to require them to do so. So that is the case for those who are wishing to go and read more about it. For those who want to read more about the judgments of the ECTHR that are relevant to gender identity, I can only also point you in the direction of Alessandra Asteritti's Genealogy of Gender Identity. It is an absolutely fabulous resource for those who are beginners on the topic, or even just slightly interested in furthering their legal knowledge and their knowledge on gender identity and human rights. I cannot recommend her writings more highly. It is really worthwhile checking out.
Yeah, she's fantastic. I'm in a group with her looking at repeal the GRA, which is why I fundamentally disagree with Michael Ferran, who argues that we can't repeal because we'll be in breach of the European Court of Human Rights. Well, I'm sorry. There's so much bad law being passed in this area. I am not going to regard them as the gold standard.
I also think, just to come in there regarding that, I think Michael, while I respect his position from what he's suggesting would be a public policy outlook on this, I think that Michael somewhat overplays, though I understand why, the willingness of a court to essentially legislate against an ECHR verdict. And the reason that I say that is because I think you see not only many courts in many countries in Europe, and I don't just mean the usual suspects, legislate against or move away from certain verdicts, but equally in UK law, it is required that they consider that. Were we to pass an act of parliament and strengthen our provisions in UK law, that consideration could be considerably watered down, in my view. Furthermore to that, obviously, we'd raise the case of Goodwin. Now, there's many excellent pieces of commentary by Goodwin, and I'd like to raise Tracy Dempsey on Twitter, who repeatedly and constantly raises the point about Dempsey, about how incredibly homophobic it is, that what vitiates the womanhood of Goodwin in that case was that he was penetrated by another man. I mean, this is homophobic nonsense. It's also misogynistic nonsense. And it really is quite shocking. And I think that if we're looking at much of the decisions that were made by the ECTHR, I do not think they would be replicated today. And Wild Woman Writing is very good on this, and I'll just quote her very finally before we move on. And she says, it's not the law of Moses. This is some very bad law here. So I think we have to include that in our considerations. And I mean, I deeply respect Michael. I think he's a very intelligent man, and I think he's very well read on the topic. I don't think he's being ambitious enough in his claims and what he's calling for. That's just my personal opinion.
You can also look at Hansard for the passing of the Gender Recognition Act. It's quite clear that they just wanted to avoid legislation for gay marriage. Women that barely get a mention were not considered, but they were really anxious not to have a situation where they could inadvertently allow gay marriage. And what they ended up doing, bizarrely, was forcing heterosexual couples to get divorced and allowing men to marry who identified, if one of them identified as a woman.
That's
But
it.
it's even me at my age, like I when I had my breast surgery, the surgeon would not do it unless I had a letter from the gender clinic to say I am of sound mind. I'm like, I don't think I am a sound mind. But you know what I mean? It's like, how do you approve that to a doctor? Like,
does is absolutely indisputably like life-saving. And you know, I've got a special place in my heart for mermaids and always will have. I think going to Gender GP, I had a long-term relationship. Like, I knew Helen and I saw what she went through with when basically what I said to her when she started looking after, when she said she expanded into supporting children and young people, I told her they're going to come after you, the establishment, the GIDS services, they're going to come after you. The other, private healthcare providers who are also within the NHS, they're going to come after you, because I'd seen it happen before. I saw it happen to Russell Reed and I saw it happen to Richard Curtis. They basically kept reporting them to the GMC and saying they weren't following protocol, they weren't doing this, they weren't doing that. And I said to Helen, expect that to happen. And she was like, well, I'm following WPATH guidance. I'm following the international, well-respected, understood to be like the gold standard. That's what I'm following. And I said, they're still going to do it. And they did. Yeah. So it started with adult GICs starting to basically make complaints about her to the GMC. There were a number, she'd done like a thread on sort of like the timeline and who complained first, etc. But it went
on for ages.
It went on for ages. So so by the middle of 2019, or sort of like into 2018-19, so she ended up suspended, her license suspended by the GMC while they were investigating. Her husband then started supporting the families and young people that she was looking after, and then couldn't. And they did the same to him. They reported him, and they managed to actually get him struck off. And I think at the time, Helen has said that they just didn't have the emotional resources or the financial resources to fight it when Mike was struck off. But then when they suspended her, and then the tribunal case came to court, and basically the medical tribunal said that she should have a 3-month suspension. Bearing in mind she'd been suspended this whole time as well, and she appealed it. So at the end of March this year, the medical tribunal heard all of the evidence, and they basically overturned everything. And they said she is at the vanguard of healthcare, trans healthcare. There was nothing wrong with the treatment that she undertook, that she's got a GP special interest, and she undertook all of the training that she possibly could. Bearing in mind, there is no specific training for gender dysphoria.
So no training.
No training then.
And so there is
a very specialised thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
but it's not even specialised because they don't have any
specialised
training.
in make
There's no training.
So there's nothing at all.
Nothing at all.
Experience and practice.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think WPATH are now introducing some training. So they're looking at introducing training, accreditation training, etc. But it's not, doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals do not have any training on gender dysphoria, either for trans adults or kids.
Because it's literal nonsense.
So, mental health professionals, they don't have any training. They don't know how to deal with it.
What if they have any on
gynephilia? That's why I think we come under the umbrella as mental health. Like when we get to see a psychiatrist, it's like, well, I understand there's some issues I've got to talk through, and yes, therapy is always good, but it's not. It's like when it becomes this mental health thing, I think that's when ableism comes into it, and because I often get people on Twitter saying, "Oh, you need psychological help." And I was like, "Well, yeah, actually, I actually could do with some of that, and I think you could too, and I think everybody in the world could do with a bit of psychological help. Thank you very much."
All I'll say there is that the idea that everyone needs psychological help is at best described as an old wife's saying. Perhaps that's a bit misogynist, so we'll scrap it and just say an old fairy tale. But again, it's I heard it at the bus stop, therefore it beats any form of clinical approach. How fitting. But one thing I do want to raise from this entire discussion is that isn't it amazing how all of this stuff was done to poor Mike? Poor Michael Wibberley. Oh, poor Mike. I feel so sorry for poor Mike. Shall we look at why Mike was struck off? Because I think it's quite important that we examine all the facts. Michael Webberley was struck off after he wrongly prescribed sex change treatment to 7 transgender patients. They included one patient who was aged 9. I just want to repeat that for everyone. That was a patient who was aged 9. That patient then, very sadly then, well, I say patient, that victim, because that is the accurate term. That victim then took their life a few months after being prescribed those blockers and those cross-sex hormones. 9. So isn't it funny how everything happened to poor old Michael and they didn't have the energy to fight against it? I think I would suggest it's more that there was no way to fight against such a damning failure, and that, quite frankly, the writing was on the wall for dear Michael Webberley. But I understand, and this is something I want to talk about Susie Green. Susie Green's talking about the establishment, and she does her scare quote, air inverted commas with her fingers. Who is the establishment in Susie Green's view? Let's bear in mind, what side was talking to the NHS with a direct line to Polly Carmichael? Was it gender critical people? Or was it Susie Green herself? What individual was advising on service specifications to the NHS? Was it the gender critical side, or was it Susie Green herself, who was referring individuals with a fast track in terms of treatment to the service and was able to change, according to Telegraph emails, rejections into referrals with the service? Was it the gender critical side, or was it Susie Green? Because it's looking to me very clearly that Susie Green is trying to claim she's not a member of the establishment, despite having a direct line to the head of the establishment that she is criticising and making demands that were then undertaken. So to be quite frank, Susie, you were a part of the establishment, and I'm afraid it's a changing of the guard. But don't you dare claim you were not a part of the establishment. You were the establishment, Susie. We all know that.
It's worth commenting as well on, she mentions Russell Reid. Now, I did a piece on Russell Reid. He was convicted of serious professional misconduct, if convicted is the right word when I'm talking about the General Medical Council. One of his patients was a paedophile. He'd concealed that offence from Russell Reid, and there was some suggestion at the time that he wanted to have the surgery to get close to his ex-boyfriends, to win his ex-boyfriend back and to get close to his children. He also was interested in, I'm probably not going to pronounce this correctly now, but apotemophilia, which is when people feel that a limb doesn't belong to them. And he actually was one of the people who signed for a doctor in Falkirk who did indeed amputate that person's leg. So Russell Reid is not exactly a victim here. He was convicted of serious professional misconduct because he didn't provide psychiatric evaluations for the patients who he referred, and hormones and surgeries were done at his behest.
To talk about private healthcare, largely because of the GMC cases, and because Helen was suspended and Mike was struck off. We were told we couldn't refer to private healthcare, and there was no other source of private healthcare. So, but for kids, young people at all.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, I couldn't talk about it. The only option left for kids was the NHS services, unless they decided to go private and go to Gender GP, which many did and are still doing. Mm-hmm. So Helen contacted me and said, look, come and work for me. You've got years of activism left. And you can actually move into a space where you can maybe have more of a direct life impact on some of these young people's lives. And
you've gone through the same kind of attacks. The same kind of people were attacking you both. So you probably got a lot of strength from sharing each other's experiences.
So now you're in the private kind of sector. Do you feel as though you've been unshackled? You've got more freedom to do what you need to do?
I can certainly see that. I mean, obviously, the charity world is, you know, you've got the charity commission, they're overseeing. There's lots of rules, etc. So it is, it's freer, and I can obviously but obviously one of the things that I've done since I came on board as community director. So a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is talking to the community and asking, you know, how can gender GP be better? Yeah. But one of the things, you know, how better can we serve it? You know, can we look after you? What are things that would, you know, be good for you? Talking to families about how to appeal against when a GP refuses shared care, for example, because so gender GP doesn't make any cash per person from medication costs or from blood tests. We work with partners. Yeah. So those don't bring revenue into gender GP at all, but they cost patients a lot of money. Yeah. So if a GP will support a person's healthcare by doing what's called shared care, so gender GP undertake the blood tests, analysing the blood tests, you know, sort of saying, this is what needs to happen. This is what your dosage is. This is what your blood tests are showing us. That if the GP will do the blood test and then send the results to gender GP, it costs the patient a stack of, you know, basically saves them a stack of money. Yeah. If they'll prescribe on the NHS what gender GP tells them they need to prescribe, that saves another stack of money. Yeah. And then all you're then paying for through gender GP is actually the cost of the subscription, and so that's like your support. Yeah. So it's kind of a gender clinic, and you, in a way, like it's not just because I think there's this conception it's just a dispensary for Tabitha. Yeah.
Gender GP, there are multiple different pathways. The general pathway, which before helping Alphaborough helped 7 others, is you apply to Gender GP, you pay £195 for an onboarding fee that makes you part of their platform. Alphaborough on top of that also paid the £16, which is a prescription fee, if given hormones after the assessment. So the next part is a clinician appointment. That's £65. You speak to a clinician, which should be able to book that appointment in a couple of days when she gets the confirm. And when you have that, they then either diagnose you with gender dysphoria or give you all the other pathways that you can go on. 9 times out of 10, what happens is they diagnose you. It then gets passed on to another clinician to look over their notes to agree or disagree. Following that, you send in your blood work from your doctors. If your doctors won't do it, they will do it for you for a fee. Once this is all done, they get your hormone levels right and you get hormones. Majority of the time, it's in about 6 weeks from start to finish. Everyone's saying this takes months or years or thousands of pounds. It does not. Mama Kaz has chosen to take a counselling path route, so maybe they want more information and everything. I've educated Alpha on every single thing that happens in this process, and it can be done in a few weeks. That email she got was not a generic email. It was including all of their things like podcasts and everything to listen to whilst awaiting an appointment, and that's how it goes.
You know what I mean? But it's a full service, and it's like, you know,
and with some real, you know, hugely experienced therapists. Many of them have got lived experience. You know, a clinical team. But yeah, I mean, obviously, after the GMC went after Helen and Mike, they then moved offshore because having a UK-based company wasn't safe, and they wouldn't have been able to continue to help all of the people that we're currently helping. But yeah, I mean, it was very much a come and work for us, and I was a bit like, okay, well, let's see what this is like, and let's see what we can achieve. And one of the things that I did as soon as I sort of came on board is they created what's called the fund a couple of years ago when Kira Bell took the Tavistock to court and got that court order. They created the fund, as they called it, and that fund then supported young people to access private healthcare. After that went, and basically the NHS just stopped looking after trans kids. So, but it wasn't really set up right. It wasn't done in the right way. They didn't have the experience of running like a charitable sort of initiative. So that's what I've taken on when I've gone into Gender GP, is creating a fund, making sure that the mechanisms are in there so that it's transparent, that we can show where the money's going. But that fund just covers healthcare from Gender GP. So we opened it with the youth fund that gained about 40. We're on about 14,500 in the youth fund, and then we had a streamer, Finsta. And they gave $50,000 US.
Yeah, Finsta's massive.
Yeah, to Gender GP, but that was like that's for adults. That's for adults, because what they said, and it's quite right, is that their content is very much of adult content.
Yeah.
So that 40 grand, what it equates to in like GB pounds, is held back just for trans adults of 18 and over. So I mean, it's still great, but there's still ongoing work that needs to happen to maintain that fund, to keep bringing money in, to ensure that when we get to so I budget for like a year's worth of care. So when they get to the end of that year, that they're not going to suddenly stop getting care. So fundraising and ongoing initiatives around how are we going to make this fundamentally something that we can continue to give. And also things like shared care. How do we get more GPs to do shared care so it costs the patient less, so then the fund doesn't have to cover as much money because the NHS services are picking it up.
That point you make about shared care and you know, GPs, I mean, it's a very relevant point, because a lot of them don't want to do shared care plans with private sector companies like Gender GP. I know my original GP wouldn't do that, refused, said they want to wait until you know, I'd got to the right stage with Sheffield at the time.
Well, I had a very.
But then when I changed to Indigo, you know, things went through quickly, and I managed to get NHS. Everything
I had a very
through Indigo and NHS, and then I actually, you know, I left Gender GP's care at that point because it was didn't need any more help. But one of the other things that was problematic with Gender GP at the time was that when you know, if you needed things like,
let's just pause there, because Susie's losing the will to live because she's going to get their whole stories now. So what's interesting is essentially what they want to do is that the GPs take the blood, they send it off, the results come back to them, they're prescribing the medication, they're literally doing everything for the patients by the sounds of it. But essentially, Gender GP want to take their cut of it by basically just giving them some advice about the measurements of the drugs, is what it sounds like. So the idea that it's a shared care arrangement essentially is a bit, in my mind, a bit of a misnomer, because they're not really doing that much work, are they? You know, correct me if I'm wrong. You know, they're not really doing much in the way of intervention. It's more of an advisory role. And of course, they literally, they need the GPs to get on board. And the idea that they've got, what I think I find particularly egregious about this clinically, is that this is not a paediatric service. The people with their lived experience in their staff that they have, as far as I'm aware, they're not all qualified with regards to children, because of course she talks about the fund for children, and this is the thing that I'm most interested in. You know, the adults are one thing, but it's the fact they're moving into child territory that I'm most worried about. They're not there's no pediatric staff. You know, there's no pediatricians. There's, you know, I don't really know about Helen Weberly's pediatric qualifications, unless you know otherwise. And then we've got this youth fund of 14.5 grand, which I guess they're kind of giving out to people who can't afford the service.
I suppose one thing I would just cut in to say is that she says about Finsta. I actually had to Google who that was. I'd never encountered this individual before. So one of the things I think is very interesting we have to examine here is Susie Green saying about the separation of funds, and in particular with regards to an individual called Finsta who donated that large amount of money to Gender GP. Finsta is an individual with an OnlyFans that role plays as a little girl, which makes this all very much more disturbing, very disturbing indeed. So that's
the 14.5 grand, is it?
That was the 500 grand. So this individual has contributed amount, and I will say at least, I will give Susie Green honesty that she will not give others. Susie Green at least learnt her lessons from Darren Mew and Jacob Breslow. That individual's funds have been completely ring-fenced and kept away from children. That's entirely the adult fund, because it's come from an OnlyFans star that is essentially exploiting childhood as a sexual kink. Although why you would want that money in the first place, I question. I think the second problem here is that Freda says that Gender GP is a full gender clinic.
Yeah, that's just bizarre. That is a really odd thing to say.
Now, I want to draw attention to people to Susie Green earlier in this interview said that one of the problems with the Tavistock was that it was entirely psychological based care. It was run by psychiatrists. And yet the great strength of Gender GP is that it's run by counsellors who provide that support. Which is it? You cannot be criticising an organisation for being psychiatric based when you are claiming that you're one. One of the greatest strengths of it is that it has such a psychiatrically led position. So I think it's nuts. And I think what's coming across here is that I also thought it was very interesting that she said Gender GP don't profit from medications or serology. So that's not what they're profiting from. So the question becomes, what's keeping Gender GP afloat?
The other thing is, obviously, you know, within the NHS, you're required to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which is, you know, a complete misnomer. I mean, it's just a made-up term, really. But you know, because it doesn't take into account all of the other people who are kind of coming in under this umbrella.
I think one thing as well to note is that we have to examine Susie Green saying that it wouldn't be safe for her to run this service in the UK for Helen Wibberley and her husband. It would not be safe for them. It's a particularly egregious comment. Under what threat are Helen Wibberley and, well, her husband under, really? I think the term they wouldn't be safe is wrong. I think it's more that they wouldn't face such scrutiny.
Yeah, they'd be held accountable.
Yeah, and that's what they're evading here. They're evading that. So I'm actually going to say to Isla that if you continue on with playing the video, you'll see something that I think is very revealing from Susie Green on this that will really just illuminate Susie Green's expertise.
Gender GP weren't able to offer those at the time because they weren't on the official list. So there was difficulties around getting everything you needed from Gender GP. So there was some things you couldn't, although they were trying to resolve that, they didn't have, the people in place to do some of those things. I don't know what the situation is now, obviously, because I'm no longer a customer, client, patient, whatever you call us, at this stage. So has that now changed? Is that now something that you could get as a patient with Gender GP?
There's off the top of my head, I don't actually know whether you get like GRC. I know that we do a lot of surgery.
It was the medical reports.
So let's be clear, we do a lot of surgery, but Susie Green doesn't actually know what services Gender GP are offering. That's really quite damning. Because this is an organisation that Susie Green has said she wanted to join because she could see what it could do, and yet she doesn't actually know what it does. That's all I'll say. I think that's damning with her own lack of any form of testimony on that one.
The thing to note is that for a gender recognition certificate, there used to be a list given out to people saying these are the people that can sign to verify your application for a gender recognition certificate. But somebody posted it the other day and pointed out that it actually does say this is not an exhaustive list. You do not have to use someone from this list. So there's always a worry that Wibberley could be allowed to sign off the gender recognition certificate approval. And just to say on the gender recognition certificate, I think there's a danger in the current debate that people think that it will be safe if we maintain the gender recognition certificate with the existing safeguards, as if there's extensive scrutiny. There is a man who was refused a gender recognition certificate by the gender recognition panel 3 times, and he took his case to court, and a single judge overturned the gender recognition panel and gave him his gender recognition certificate. So he's now a woman in law. He's a thrice married man with 7 children who has a conviction for obtaining explosives with intent to endanger life. And I cover that case on my blog.
I think the other thing as well there.
What's it under, Tish? What's the heading if people want to look it up?
I can send you a link.
I think the other thing here to note as well is that, and it's very important in terms of repeal, simply getting rid of GRCs is not going to be enough, because there are currently people getting changed driver's license and passport without any GRC, simply contacting the DVLA or passport office and intimating that they are protected under the characteristic of gender reassignment, or simply that they identify as women, seems to be currently enough. So I think that's something else to bear in mind here, that actually getting a GRC, even though obviously we oppose that, and we absolutely do not want Webberley handing out GRCs. That is a hellish scenario. That is a doomsday scenario in my book. Equally, a lot of the things that people think are associated with a GRC, people are now getting without GRCs regardless. So I think that's something that people should take into account.
Being able to get a passport in a female identity has been going on since before the Gender Recognition Act was passed. I think Alexandra has, she has better information, but I certainly know that, for example, there's an Irish, Lydia Foy. He had a passport in a female name going back as far as 1993. And I think it was going back, I think Alessandra managed to find that it went back even before that. So yes, it is, that's also a loophole.
So like you were saying, Freda, that you got like, you needed we do a lot of those. Yeah. And we've got very experienced, trained counsellors, as I say, with lived experience, etc. So it's not, it's not just a dispensary. That's not what Gender GP is. Awesome. But I think obviously Helen's view is that we should be able to provide everything that that a trans person needs, a point of access into Gender GP. So she's constantly looking at ways to add to what we do, how we do it, what we can deliver. But I don't know specifically about the GRC.
I'm not sure. Reports where the person who's doing the report has to be a doctor on the GMC list. So, it was very difficult for them to do that at the time because of the troubles that were going on.
You see, I had a really interesting one. Sorry, I was going to say, because when I first went to my GP, obviously, it's a bit of a complicated story with me, because when I was young, my mum tried to help me, and I sort of detransitioned, and then it took me a long time to come back. So when I came to the doctor like 3 or 4 years ago, my doctor really wanted to help. Like, she'd known me for quite a while. She knew I'd spoken to her. And she said, I can't do anything because I can't prescribe. You have to go through the gender clinic. Now, she would have wanted, if you could have assessed me, and because she's known me, she knows this is what I want. And I would think if the GPs could be have more information, that would be so much easier. Because like, I feel like we have to go through so many hoops and jump over so many hurdles.
I think a GP can prescribe, but
they can.
But initially, because they've got no support, they don't.
Initially, my GP anything about it, so didn't have any. Like you were saying, they're not trained in gender dysphoria, and without a psychiatrist or a psychologist's report, they're very nervous, aren't they, to do anything like that?
It's because that the GMC will come after them legally.
Or maybe not now. After Helen's been vindicated, I think.
It's different now. Helen. Helen's been through that has changed a lot of that.
Yeah, I think that what we need now is a few like brave GPs to put their heads above the parapets, because the chances of them being, them being pursued by the GMC is like, obviously with Helen, literally the medical tribunal have said your thinking was flawed. We don't, she should never have had to go through this, and that she's been vindicated, and her healthcare has been held up as like really progressive, and as I say, at the vanguard of. So you think about those kind of things, and you think hopefully somebody somewhere is like, I've got a special interest in this. I'm going to learn about this. I'm maybe going to do a WPATH course. I'm going to look at the endocrine guidelines. I'm going to look at the WPATH guidelines. I'm going to look at what needs to be done. I mean, GPs prescribe every day things that are 100 times more toxic than HRT, and they'll give HRT to people who come through the door without hesitation.
Exactly.
But they won't prescribe exactly the same thing just because it's a trans person. And I think, you've got to look at the reasoning behind that. And a lot of that is fear of persecution.
And
the media.
And it's the mental health
GMC,
stigma.
And the mental health, the mental health stigma.
Yeah.
But I mean, gender dysphoria, gender incongruence is not a mental health issue.
Exactly. That point I made about medical reports, that like Gender GP was having trouble doing that. I mean, that's no different for Indigo. Indigo can't do it either, and they're an NHS organisation. Well, they're a private organisation, but they've been,
it's outsourced.
Given outsourced by the NHS. So they can't do it either. They have to refer it off to, I think it's Nottingham GIC, which is their kind of parent GIC. So, it's not just Gender GP that can't do that. Somewhere like Indigo can't either, which is shocking, really, when you think about it.
So many things to be said there, isn't there? I'm going to just keep saying it. I still freaking out at the idea of a company abroad thinking that they should be getting involved with children and managing their healthcare. Giving HRT to men is not this in massive quantities is an opposite sex hormone. It's not the same as giving a little microdose patch to a female. That is completely different business. It's not an issue about fear and persecution, I'm afraid. I think the other thing about her being, I'll let you talk about being progressive in Vanguard and the WPATH guidelines. The other thing about gender dysphoria not being a mental health issue, I've just talked about this ad nauseum, haven't I? And of course, they're not going to bring up anything to do with autogynephilia as a fetish either. They're not going to mention that clearly.
I think it's very interesting that we were listening to Helen Weberle being described as at the vanguard of medical science, at the frontier. But the exact term was she was at the vanguard. And she was incredibly progressive. So I decided I would go away and do a little bit of research. And I in particular went to the court judgment laid out, because it's incredibly important that we do this, just to ensure that we're being absolutely fair. This is before Mr. Justice J, and it was between Dr. Helen Weberle, who was the appellant, and the General Medical Council, who was the respondent, and the judgment was handed down on the 31st of the 3rd, 2023. And I had a look for the word vanguard in this document. It's funny how it doesn't appear. And then I looked for the word progressive. It's funny how that doesn't appear either. So, if we're saying that Helen Weberle was found to be this progressive person at the vanguard, where did that actually come from? Well, if I type in Helen Weberle, and then go Helen Weberle Vanguard, because it's very important. Oh, it's very funny what comes up. An article from Gender GP. Ooh, could this be the source? And then if I type Apple F Vanguard, ooh, what does it say? It says, however, after exhaustive examination by the UK Medical Practitioners Service, the MPTS, the tribunal found her model of care to be at the vanguard of this evolving approach of transgender care. Interesting. So I'm just going to put in that exact quote, at the vanguard of this evolving approach to medical care. I'm just going to include contains. No, it's not coming up, I'm afraid, in the judgment. How odd, how peculiar. I'm not going to mark someone else's homework, but if you're saying that Mr. Justice J ruled that Helen Weberle was an incredibly progressive practitioner in the vanguard of medical science, you could at least cite your sources, please. Although we know that's a bit of a problem. The second thing I'd like to bring up here is that, again, we are talking about psychiatry and about how psychiatry is great. But yet Susie, earlier in this interview, was talking about how psychiatry, like psychiatric-led approaches were terrible. Again, this is a lot of this is doublespeak, because these people are demanding that these individuals have access to support counsellors and mental health services.
Mental health issue. So it's not a mental health issue, it's counsellors. But But
if you're not sick, why do you need life-saving care? Susie Green earlier in this interview said that mermaids provide, and she says, I always have a special place in my heart for mermaids because I truly do believe they provide life-saving care.
Right, life-saving.
If they're not ill, how do you save their life?
Exactly. They're so distressed. They're just, distraught, distress. They have so much, it's absolutely life-saving. Without it, would you rather have an alive son or a dead daughter, whatever? It's not a mental health issue, but basically we need to chop off your body parts and give you huge levels of medication. But actually, it's just about your embodiment. It's a complete lifestyle choice. We're classifying it under sexual health. The whole of the WPATH guidelines were essentially written by captured people with lived experience rather than, highly respected medical professionals. Tish, what's your thoughts?
Just what occurred to me was that there was a long discussion about when they took out the mental health aspect from the diagnosis manual. And I read a piece by Dr. Anne Lawrence, who is himself an autogynephilic man. Yeah. And he opposed the removal of that clause because he thinks that they do need mental health services. But his take on it was that it was political, and it was, how do we get insurance to cover access to surgeries and hormones without making it a medical treatment necessary because there's something wrong with you? So it was all politics about how could we still get access to the life-saving care, but we don't want to be called mentally ill.
I think that point on insurance is really, really important, particularly in the States, because they have, these companies are not going to cough up vast quantities of cash unless there is some, clinical issue. It's interesting that, to me, that in terms of funding, that this has all gone into specialist commissioning within the UK, because I'm sure that you were part of the stakeholder response, and obviously we went through this in another video, but they've managed to get themselves sectioned off and into a little cubby hole in the UK, and I think that has been done, very purposefully, rather than be in the mainframe, because it does allow them to be able to essentially do what they want and to create, special categories and special circumstances, and essentially just make it up as they go along, which is what they're doing, of course.
With it, so literally they had no notice. They served them with notice of closure, and they were meant to close within a few months. They're still open, and they're still going to be open for a while. They talked about these new regional hubs. Yeah. Again, when? I mean, we're hoping that we might see the first one towards the end of this year and then the second at the beginning of next year. But they said they'd be up and running by spring 2023.
Well, everything in the NHS and now they're also talking about changing the way that they, do the prescribing. It's on. You have to be part of a
clinical trial. The new service specifications that they have brought out that sort of supersede the 2016 service specification. It was entirely based on evidence that replaced age with stage of puberty, etc. Introduced blockers at Tanner stage 2 to 3. They've just completely reversed all of that, and they've gone into you're not going to get blockers unless you're part of a research study, which is highly unethical, because it basically is forcing people into that study if they want care. They have said that if you go private, then you might end up being referred to social services. I mean, I don't know how social services think they're going to deal with that, and social workers are like, why on earth would they refer us? The ability to go private is basically enshrined in the NHS principles. Yeah. But why? And again, it's different, but it's only different for trans people. They're talking about social transition, so literally somebody changing their hair, changing their gender expression, maybe using different pronouns, and maybe changing their name. They're talking about that not being a neutral act and sort of implying that it could be dangerous. Yeah. And how are you going to police what a young person wears? Yeah, exactly. How they style their hair, whether they grow it or whether they cut it. Yeah, exactly. And so it's like we're getting back into Gilead. We're looking at kids and going, right, okay, you can't look like that. Yeah. because you're not allowed to socially transition. And now we're seeing school guidance leaked in the Sun a couple of days ago, where they're saying
Rishi Sunak.
Saying that you can't.
Once again, all these things are connected in my mind.
All connected, and again, like this politics of distraction.
Interesting.
But it's terrible. It's terrible.
Interesting thing to me about that story, that's like, about the it's this guidance, so it's like, could it not be that children just ask questions, and when children ask questions, you've got to have good answers. It's not teachers forcing anything on kids, because you can't make somebody trans, no matter how much these people think you can. So the children are already asking the question. They're bringing it to the classroom. They'll say, Miss, I've heard about you can be 1,200 genders. So if the teacher doesn't know how to have that conversation, then maybe that's why the guidance should exist. It shouldn't be to stop people expressing themselves. It should be to encourage that. Because if you stop it, you shame people. You make people feel shame. And this story that came into the press about these two schoolgirls bullying a child, because when the government becomes the bully, what authority do teachers have to stamp out bullying? And then it has a knock-on effect on the children, because they can be emboldened if they have parents that believe things in the Daily Mail. And then we had, I know it's an extreme example, but what happened to Brianna Jai? That was a 16-year-old girl, and they were young people. They were school-age children that committed that atrocity. So don't tell me, Rishi Sunak, that what you say doesn't have any effect on, real people's lives, because it does. And this is why it gets me.
Just for all our listeners at home, I'm going to do some very charitable work here and say that Freda means allegedly committed that attack. Allegedly were involved, just so we can all be clear. And I would obviously encourage nobody to comment on a live proceedings, because obviously not just for your own benefit, but for the benefits of a fair trial. I think it would be also remiss to say that this might be a bit of a wild connection to make in the first place to completely unrelated events. Now, I want to talk about the two school children who were bullied by a teacher, and the teacher quite fervently attacked them. If you're talking about bullies, it is bullying to make a child tell a lie, and to enforce that they must tell that lie, and to enforce that they cannot tell the truth, that there will be punishment for telling that truth, to the point that they will have to find a different school, was, I believe, the exact words used by the teacher. So it is bullying to the level of you will have to leave. And bear in mind, that was a threat coming from a teacher. It wasn't coming from another pupil about how hard we'll bully you. That was a teacher saying, I think you'll have to find another school. This is outrageous. Now, the idea that we are inherently, these people were bullying other children is nonsense. What it is it's Darvel. We are seeing two girls who are refusing to lie. They're refusing to lie and say that someone can be a cat or any other. You can change your sex. And we saw a teacher crack down on that and demand that they repeat the lies, which is unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable. And I think it's shocking. As for the Gilead reference, I think when you examine social transition, it's very interesting how these people are trying to suggest that, the way you style your hair is social transition. No. Because what these people are trying to suggest is the moment you change your hairstyle is the moment you change gender. They're trying to make that link themselves. And hence, what they are trying to say is it shouldn't be punished. We agree that it shouldn't be punished, but social transition is more than that. Social transition is not just changing pronouns, it is also changing names. It is parents often not being informed of that at all by teachers. And the idea that social transition is merely, someone changed their hair today, is utter lunacy. And it's also people who haven't read or experienced any testimony on the topic.
I have to say, I'm really upset with Freda listening to this story being told. You'll know that I've worked with over 700 parents now with their school complaints, and very, very many of them have children in this situation who I've tried to support, and then I pass them also on to Bayswater and Our Duty. These children and families are destroyed, right? We're talking about utter carnage here. And these kids have in fact been fed this information via RSE, PHSE, from these third-party groups going into schools, providing all of this different information. These kids that are then believing that they have these identities and are being fed scripts, but via various different social media platforms, etc. They're going on to do unenrolled deed poll name changes, complete breakdown in family harmony and relationships, etc. And it's heartbreaking to see. So it's incredibly disappointing to see the level of misinformation and lack of understanding here. I just can't understand why you would, Freda would talk about the school's guidance in such a kind of flippant fashion, and really at this stage be, called upon as a commentator and really have such a poor handle on this issue, when there is clearly so much trauma and such an epidemiological, complete shift in the incidents of these new cases of girls presenting, and this absolute astronomic change, that they can just so flippantly cast this aside and believe that this is just
do you not think that Freda is simply doing this because Freda wants to equate it to homophobia? Because that's what I'm reading. This is about, if a little girl changes her hair or cuts it short, these people will hate her, these people will report her. No, it's more, for example, when a child comes into a class and says, I think I'm transgender, that alarm bells are raised, red flags start to appear. It's totally different. I think what Freda is essentially trying to suggest is that these people are homophobic and they will attack what Freda would call gender diverse younger people, what I will call as sex non-conforming younger people. In particular, I think younger boys, which totally misses the point about younger girls and the epidemiology of that. But this is, at the end of the day, I think, a sleight of hand, and I think it's very visible, and I think it's nonsense. But again, they have to go to the extreme. They have to go to a very tragic incident in which an individual was murdered or lost their life to make that point. And I think that that's a very regrettable point of view, and someone who was wise to any form of, well, firstly decency, but also respect would never have made that.
I also think that it's in their interest to serve up all of these children, because it props up all of these adults in this situation. It makes their issues look more legitimate. But there you go. Tish, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, social transition isn't a neutral act. And I've seen testimony from parents who were actually going stealth with their children in primary school. Now, if you have been told by your parents that you're the opposite sex and everybody in your school thinks you are, how the school are colluding with that, I don't know. But obviously then you're going to get to a point where your body is developing in a way that you've been taught or you feel isn't the one for you. So that's going to ramp up the desire for medical treatments to block. So it's concretizing an identity at too young an age. And it's also not just doing it for the one child. If you were expecting all the other children in the class to validate that identity, you are involving other people's children in your child. It's also incredibly regressive and assumes that any of us, speaking for myself, long hair, I don't care. Gorgeous fingernails, I don't care. You can be flamboyant, you can express yourself exactly the way that you want to be, and we should all be accepting of that, because it's probably, I would say it was a natural phenomenon in some gay men, and we should be supportive of that and not telling them that means that they're somehow less than a man. That's the regressive thing. But these people seem to think that we are the ones that are saying you can't wear pink, you can't grow your hair, you can't carry a Barbie bag. I don't care about any of those things. If that's what you feel confident doing in yourself, have at it. But to say that makes you less of a man, that's homophobic.
And also, Tish, let's remember that who's the individual here that on instructions of her homophobic husband deprived her child of toys and dresses and any form of what was perceived as feminine toys or dress, and then also was enforcing that he couldn't behave in a feminine way? Who's the individual here who's done that? It's not Isla, it's not me, it's not you, it's Susie Green. Susie Green was the individual who envisaged that terror. Susie Green has inflicted that upon her child.
Ironically, my son's absolute favourite film, Little Mermaid, and his dad got him a Barbie and made him a Little Mermaid's tail out of tin foil. Obviously, we didn't know about mermaids at that stage.
I think also the point you made, Tish, is an important one on the basis that it's very different to sexuality in that sexuality doesn't require other people to take part in it in terms of, the general public. But of course, gender identity does require other people to take part in the fantasy, because in order to carry off the issue that you are replicating the presentation of a member of the opposite sex, it requires other people to take part in that fantasy and to affirm this. And of course, within the school setting, as you said, that is not something which is where is causing a lot of problems. Hence, we're trying to push the government to actually offer up schools guidance. And I think that all the three people in front of us here actually cannot accept that there is always going to be a certain proportion of the population, like certainly like me, I'll speak for myself, I will never accept that certain people have are presuming that they've made this change. That's never going to be something that I'm going to accept willingly, and that is a difficult issue. So that they can present as many slurs as they wish, but that will actually just make no difference to the situation of the reality. And that's I can see it in their faces and their words that is something they are not going to be able to move past.
Well, I think this is why it's an authoritarian movement, because these people who've intervened medically in their children, they've effectively promised them something that they can't deliver on.
Yeah.
Unless they force us all to lie.
Right.
And I won't do it.
No.
I'll add my own agreement to that. And I think that's why Helen Joyce, talking about these parents who have harmed their own child, have done the worst thing possible, something that is totally inexcusable, will be the equivalent of the Japanese soldiers after the fall of Tojo fighting on those atolls in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, Helen Joyce is absolutely right on that. We will be fighting these people till the end of time, I'm afraid.
They have to keep going because.
But you know what? I agree. I agree. I'm up for the fight. I'm up for fighting the absurdity. I will not do it. More importantly than that, I don't believe anyone can change sex as well. And I think that that's really important. You will not make me say something that is absurd. I will not humiliate myself. I will not humiliate my intelligence. And I will not humiliate anyone else or force them to. That is just core to what I believe. So I think that that's really important. And all I would say on The Little Mermaid, Tish, is that isn't it funny how similar Susie Green and Helen Weberly are to Ursula? Poor unfortunate souls. I want a duet of them singing that. Or perhaps they're actually the fish that surround Ursula, because that's perhaps a better kind of equivalent of their pond life, if I'm being totally honest. I do hope that makes it in.
And I think that's it. That moves us brilliantly on to the next point, which I'm not going to comment on too much, but I think that people will be able to understand from the inference. So if we move into it.
35 to stop it, I think is absolutely disgusting.
It is.
That was probably one of the most, they're saying, it consulted upon pieces of legislation that the Scottish government have brought in ever. And for,
no women, though.
Block it, I think it's, again, it 30p Lee was saying that, we're gonna we're going to do the next general election, we're going to fight it on woke issues, and trans rights are going to be one of them. So they're literally saying we're going to use one of the most vulnerable populations who are subject to the most discrimination and prejudice, and we're going to leverage their pain and their suffering, and we're going to pick on them even more than we already have done, just so that we can divert from the fact that we're absolutely fucking shit.
Yes.
Exactly. That's it. That's it.
Such nuanced commentary there, Susie.
It's just disgusting. And all of this stuff around, you know, the EHRC, we've got...
Ben Hunt's article. Yeah.
You know, Kemi Badenoch talking to the EHRC, Baroness Faulkner, it just makes me feel sick. I mean...
Yeah, the minister does her job.
That organisation is corrupt now, and the way they try to play it in the press as poor Baroness Faulkner, she's
we've seen all the stuff that's been going on the HRC over the past.
Those people, right, just for the people on the podcast, those people are bought and paid for. They're not your friends, right? They're not people that are working for any human rights.
The HRC is supposed to be an independent organisation that's been totally taken over completely by the Tories. You know, that is totally wrong. They
had to get somebody from the UN to come over and intervene, didn't they? What was it called? Victor Breslow.
Yeah, Victor Madrigal.
Victor.
And then he's basically come away from here and gone, wow.
Yeah.
You know, no wonder the UK are falling down the index in terms of equality and human rights, and has come back with some really damning stuff around the EHRC is meant to protect people's rights, but instead, you know, they're looking at rolling back trans rights, and this, you know, what they're trying to do with this, you know, this changing the definition of sex will affect everybody who's got a GRC as well as people who don't. So yeah, I think it's disgusting, and it's very cynical. And it's
all the arguments of sex matters don't weigh up at all in a social reality, because all the arguments every single argument requires there to be a threat from somewhere, and the threat is trans people. And it doesn't matter. You can have all these arguments about sports and prisons and single sex spaces, and we're sure if you have an argument, you know, you can find instances where we have to safeguard, and those things already exist. But you'd think if you listen to any of these people that trans women especially are just an imminent danger to society. That's the level of debate they have.
Tish, tell us a little bit about Victor Madrigal.
Yeah, I've actually sent you the link. So Victor Madrigal received $100,000 from the Arcus Foundation. Anybody who's been paying attention, they fund a huge amount. And in fact, it was Arcus Foundation who gave Stonewall $100,000 to add the T to their lobbying. So that's the first thing. Victor Madrigal also got another $200,000 routed from the Arcus Foundation, but via Harvard University. So independent expert? I think not. Independent experts, UN rapporteurs, they don't get a salary. So, but he's got 300 grand. And he's clearly delivering, because he never talks about same-sex attraction. He's constantly on about gender identity ideology. So I've sent you a link to part 1 of my piece on Victor Madrigal.
Thank you.
I think also, just a question, is there a woman who Freda has ever felt sympathy for? Genuine question, because it's always demeaning. Always, they're dinosaurs, they're horrible. Always demeaning women. And again, it's such an affected way of referring to Baroness Faulkner. You know, Baroness Faulkner is an extremely well-respected politician, extremely well-respected. And I'm laughing that Susie Green, her criticism of Kemi Badenoch is that, Kemi Badenoch went and spoke to the head of a human rights body about human rights when she's a Minister for Women of Equalities. Yes, more up news at 10.
Don't forget the EHRC had an ex-member of Stonewall in charge of them before. So they were used to having that as a captured audience. And now that some balance looking at other protected characteristics has come in, they're not liking it.
And it seems to be as well that there's a lot of criticism of Kemi Badenoch about her doing her job. Essentially, a minister consults human rights body on changes to human rights law. I mean, this this is utterly bizarre. This is utterly bizarre to be throwing out the bathwater on, but it's typical here because this is all hyperbole. And what we're essentially seeing here is, oh well, we have to get rid of the Tories. I won't repeat the language of Susie Green, but you get the idea. I wonder how confident she is about voting for the Labour Party now, because I know obviously the Labour Party's position hasn't changed too much, but the rhetoric certainly will not be pleasing Mrs. Green, I don't think. But at the end of the day, when we're coming down to this discussion, there's also a claim here that needs to be rebutted, which is that white men with a fetish are the most vulnerable identity or minority, which is just nonsense. And all I would say to Mrs. Green is, please cite your sources.
If you can't explain something, because obviously, like, trans people have this problem of having to describe their own experience all the time, but you're not always an expert in your own condition. You can only read about why you feel a certain way. So sometimes this thing comes up about, oh, I feel like I'm trapped in the wrong body. That's a legitimate thing to feel. But because it becomes a bit of a cliche and people mock that, then maybe that's the only way that person knows how to express it.
It's a really simple way to explain it.
Yeah.
It's a really simplified way to explain it to other people, and that's fine. And if that's your truth and your reality, and that's what my daughter says. Yeah. You know, she's like, exactly. You know, this is my body, but I've had to fix it to reflect who I am.
Yeah. So, my take on that is that we're all born in the wrong body, and the fact that some people feel it more, because obviously there's lots of medical problems people can have with it, but the body is always going to fail you, no matter how healthy you think you are. So the body is something we all, like, philosophically, and I try to escape from, and I think that's why a lot of people struggle. Like, a lot of girls especially struggle with physical thing when, things about self-harming and things like that. And these all get thrown in by people that are anti-trans as a kind of, weapon towards that. But actually, no, these are things that we need to talk about. And if you prevent people talking about them, or you give them a sense of shame, they never will. They're never going to be able to. And it's the same thing with a trans person, with their body. Like, I felt really conscious about my body and talking about it because it just felt icky, So, positivity, that's what I'm spreading.
But no, seriously, I just going to say it now. I've got a new phrase, and it's called Aunt Freda's sayings. We all are mentally ill. We've all got problems with our body. We're all born in the wrong body. Can you imagine
we are literally all born in the wrong body.
What's the right body? What's the right body? But no, seriously, it's getting to a point now. Could you imagine going to see Dr. Freda and well, actually, that's quite a thought, but could you imagine going to see Dr. Freda? And Dr. Freda says, yes, come in, come and sit down.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I've had problems with my joints. Well, we all have problems with our joints. In fact, I say to some people all the time, we're all born with the wrong joints.
Yeah, and actually, we're literally in the wrong body.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm actually a bit insane as well. This is nonsense. This is utter complete nonsense. But do you know what it is? It's something that's done often, and it's a technique. It's affable. And what it's done is it's kind of fake humility. It's like, we're all kind of born in the wrong body. Well, no, we're not. And it's incredibly dangerous to say. I also think what was even more alarming was, aside from our sideshows, Sideshow Freda and Sideshow Vicky, we had the main attractions saying that her daughter had to fix her body. So was it broken then?
Yeah. There's only just so much stupid that I can take, and I think I might have reached my capacity. My systematizing brain is just like completely combusted now, at the point of the lived experience overdrive now. Tish,
just before Tish comes in, Isla, do you remember that sketch from Harry and Paul about women know your limits, and then it has the diagram of a woman's brain receiving education, and then at a certain level it kind of overloads. That's us. This podcast, our brains are starting to overload.
I was thinking, I actually haven't eaten that anymore. I think I'm just about to pass out now, and I think that could may well have finished me off. Bring it home, Tish. What are you thinking?
Oh, I'm just thinking about all the mermaids-inspired training that is going on in our schools. I've documented and looked on a lot of those research materials propaganda tools that are going into school. Who knew that if you fostered a bodily dissociation, you would end up with a spike in kids being uncomfortable with their own body? We have manufactured this, and we are committing iatrogenic, I cannot pronounce that, harm by basically iatrogenic. Yeah, we're teaching our children to reject themselves for what they are, whether they're autistic and they don't filter things and socialize and are able to understand things in the same way that, you know, other children can, or whether they're a flamboyant gay male or a butch lesbian, or you're in flight from your body because you've suffered child sexual abuse. We're just delivering the most traumatized, harmed, damaged kids into the hands of ideologues. And let's not forget kids in foster care. There's no reason why they should be overrepresented in gender clinics, unless we are just simply funneling the most vulnerable children into the hands of these gender abattoirs. Makes me furious.
Who are the parents that are the brothers, the sisters? We need them to stand up, because if they don't, the trans population is small and they're vulnerable. And we need to be standing up and basically standing up for people and going, this isn't right. And this is not about whether or not trans people should be trans, but just be a decent fucking human being.
Exactly. Exactly. It's about empathy, and some people just lack it, like that empathy. And
I think most trans people I know are feeling pretty exhausted and worn out with it all. You know, so it's
exactly.
You see, the problem with me is I'm kind of analytical, and I like watching parliamentary debates, and I like breaking them down points and working out the argument. And I get to a point where I think, gosh, I have no life.
I think we hear you. I think we're all tired. I think we're all feeling drained. But I tell you, the one thing that I disagree with is that we do have empathy. I have an abundance of empathy for all of the damaged people that have been hurt as a result of this whole ideology. I have a huge amount of empathy for the families, for the children, for the detransitioners, for everyone, even for the people who are still in it, who are still captured by the madness of it all. I don't have huge amounts of empathy for some of the most, privileged people who are basically trying to drive this whole narrative. So yeah, allyship can basically do one, as far as I'm concerned. I'm so over it.
This from the people who, in their previous series of the podcast, brought you an interview with convicted felon and jailbird.
Yeah. He's now back in prison.
Convicted felon and jailbird serving at His Majesty's pleasure. One, Alan Baker, who is best known for his attempted murder, but also he was a convicted torturer and sexual predator. So
we're not forgetting eating of testicles, are we?
Well, no, but I thought that was a bit blue for people sitting there listening to this. Oh, if they've made it this far, hell mend them. But no, seriously, but this is, I think we need to cut in here. These people are saying we need to lack empathy. I really just want us to listen to the words of Alan Baker about what we should do to TERFs.
Jane Baker, I run an organisation called the Trans Prisoner Alliance. There's over 1,000 transgender prisoners, and we're counting on you out here, right? Listen, there are some really bad transgender prisoners. There f***ing are. I'm not going to lie to you. But there's about 980 of us who are just trying to live our lives behind bars, without testicles, in male prisons, against our will. Well, I was going to come here and be really fluffy and be really nice and say, yeah, be really lovely and queer and gay. Nah, if you see a TERF, punch him in the f***ing face.
And how many people are cheering him on? Did he get a boo? Did he get people heckling him? I don't think so. So when it comes to empathy, I don't think we're the movement publicly calling for the assault of others, and then having one of our major bodies, aka Trans Pride, defend the statement and defend the maker of the statement. Although I think we're now at a point where this be kind nonsense is now really failing them, because it is always be kind. That is what people are told when a boundary transgressor is trying to erode your boundaries. Oh, be kind, be nice, just let them do it. No, stop it. Stop transgressing people's boundaries. And frankly, to these three, to Susie Green, I'm very glad. Obviously, people will have cottoned on to the fact that she recorded this video whilst she was at Gender GP. As she says, let's see what I can do. Well, thankfully, not a lot. How sad, oh dear, never mind, comes to mind. So goodbye, Susie. But for Vicky and Freda, all I would say is that, isn't it interesting that when it comes down to it, you accuse people of lacking empathy, and yet all I will say is Henrietta Freeman, and people can make up their own mind on that entire situation. Because people should go and look at what happened there. People should know what was done there, because that was absolutely terrible. That was absolutely disgraceful, and people need to be aware of it. So on that note, I'm very happy to say that I have now endured this for a third time, this podcast, although maybe that's not quite accurate, 2.5 times, and I hope I never have to see it again. But it's been a pleasure to do it with you two, very much certainly. It's been an absolute joy to melt my brain with you, and I hope we can melt our brain in future.
Yes. Tish, over any closing thoughts from you?
Just a very wise woman said, be kind really means be compliant.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect closing points. Thank you very much, you two. You're amazing.